Okay, it looks like we have a quorum, so I'm ready to begin. If I could just be informed as to when we're live, and then I'll start the meeting.
We are live.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Kilgore. I am the designated federal officer for the Science Advisory Board Staff Office for the EJScreen Review Panel. The EJScreen Review Panel was established to consider the EJScreen methodology and update calculations for the EJ indexes released publicly in 2022, as well as other aspects of the calculations. The panel previously met in March and May of this year, where they received a briefing from EPA and deliberated on the charge questions. Since the May meeting, the panel has developed an integrated draft responses to charge questions. Today will be the review of that integrated draft to make sure the panel agrees on recommendations for the EJScreen draft report, which they will develop following today's discussion. As a reminder, all materials pertaining to this meeting, including the panel's draft integrated responses to the charge questions, are available on the SAB website. At this time, as DFO, I would like to formally open today's public meeting and proceed to discuss administrative remarks. The SAB is an independent expert advisory committee chartered under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. The SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research Development and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on scientific and technical underpinnings of EPA's decisions. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions between the EPA and the public be conducted in open session, where I, as DFO, am present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that during public meetings, opportunities for the public to provide oral and written comments are available. There is an opportunity in today's agenda for members of the public to provide oral comments. However, we have received no registered speakers for today. Members of the public could have registered in advance with the SAB staff office to make oral comments. Members of the public also have the opportunity to provide written comments, which were distributed to the committee and posted on the SAB website. In accordance with FACA, minutes will be prepared for today's meeting and posted on the SAB website to summarize the discussion and action items for the meeting. The SAB consists entirely of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions, and as government employees, members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has reviewed the financial disclosure forms submitted by committee members, along with other information related to their involvement in this activity. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no conflict of interest or appearances of lack of impartiality concerning to the topics on the agenda of this meeting. As a reminder, some members of the public are listening via teleconference lines, so I ask that committee members please identify yourselves before speaking. And now, before I hand the meeting over to Dr. Chakraborty, I'm going to quickly take roll. So when I call your name, if you could please just indicate present, and then we can proceed with the meeting. So first, Dr. Chakraborty.
Present.
Dr. Alion.
Present.
Dr. Archer.
Present.
Dr. Ock. Who's tentative. Dr. Barakal.
Present.
Mr. Carr. Okay. Dr. Collins.
Present.
Ms. Fritz.
Present.
Dr. Hu.
Present.
Dr. Kanofsky.
Present.
Ms. Lewis.
Present.
Dr. Min.
Present.
Dr. Rojas.
Present.
Dr. Sad.
Present.
Dr. Sharma.
Present.
Dr. Smeltz.
Present.
Dr. Wilson. Okay. Mix Yoder. Okay. And Dr. Zuniga.
Present.
Excellent. Okay. At this time, I would like to hand the meeting over to Dr. Chakraborty to begin today's deliberations.
All right. Thank you, Carolyn, for your opening remarks and the excellent work you've done so far for this panel and helping us stay on track, through this process. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I am Jay Chakraborty, chair of this EJScreen review panel and a member of the EPA's Science Advisory Board, or chartered ASAB, that's seeking this review. Thank you all for coming here today to attend this important public meeting. I'll begin with some background information and a quick overview of our agenda for today. The EPA Science Advisory Board, or SAB staff office, has selected this panel of experts and brought us together to conduct a peer review of the revised and updated version of EJScreen, the EPA's environmental justice mapping and screening tool. And as many of you remember, our review panel met on May 8th, 9th, and 10th to deliberate and discuss responses to the 16 charge questions. Following this meeting, the lead writers for each topic category work with their assigned panel members to develop an integrated response for their respective topic categories. So a big thank you to all lead writers and panel members for doing an outstanding job. And after we received your integrated responses, I worked with the DFOs, Carolyn and Zaida, to further edit and incorporate individual comments in the text of the document, and which led to the creation of a document that we're now referring to as Integrated Draft Responses to Charge Questions. After our meeting today, we will work on developing the draft report that will be reviewed and approved at a virtual public meeting in mid-August. Now, the purpose of this meeting is for our EJScreen review panel to reach agreement or consensus on the recommendations for each charge question. Since our time is limited, we'll try to avoid or hold off on discussing specifics related to the exact language of the draft, unless there is any information missing or misrepresented. If we find any important info missing or misrepresented, please bring it to our attention. We'll then make a note of the page and line numbers, and we'll ask for new language from the panel member who brings it to our attention. Now, our agenda today allows only 30 minutes for each topic category, not 30 minutes for each question. So I'll ask the lead writers and panel members assigned to each topic category to identify any recommendation they think requires clarification or deletion, any additional recommendations, and the tier where it should be placed. And lastly, if any of the existing recommendations need to be tiered differently. We will then seek feedback from the rest of the panel, followed by seeking consensus from the panel on including the changes. If we have consensus, we'll make note of the recommendation and the individual requesting the change and reach out to them for finalizing the exact language for our report. If we don't have consensus, we can do one of two things. Option number one would be to agree to incorporate the recommendation or recommendations as a suggestion rather than a firm recommendation. If the panel does not agree with that, move to option number two, add the recommendation to an appendix. But of course, our preference always is to have a report with complete consensus as far as possible. And as we move to the next item in today's agenda, I'd like to remind everyone again that our panel's charge is to review the current version of EJScreen that was released in October 2022. Having said that, it may be useful to hear of some of the new additions or changes that are being incorporated in the next version, version 2.2 of EJScreen. So I would like to first invite Tai Lung from the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights to give us a brief update on what's new in this upcoming version 2.2 of EJScreen.
Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. And thank you all to the whole panel. Thanks for all the hard work you've put in on this. Thanks for all the deep thought that you've really given to making EJScreen a better tool. the tool means a lot to us, and it's really exciting that we have so many great minds behind it, trying to help us improve it as we go forward. As I started to read through the draft recommendations that you all have provided, I'm really just impressed by how much you all have dug into some of these topics that we've been working on for years in such a short time, and you've come up with so many great solutions. We're pretty excited about all of this. One of the things I did want to mention as we move forward, I really like how the recommendations have been broken down into short-term and longer-term recommendations, because as an agency, it's going to be hard for us to incorporate some of these immediately. But one of the other things that would be very helpful would be to see more differentiation between some of the things that are doable currently. Some of these recommendations seem like they might be touching on some data that we don't have. And then it's also important to note what is within the purview of our office, the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, and what is some things that are outside of the locus of our control. So anyway, that said, I wanted to dive real quick into some of the changes that we are making with EJScreen right now. We had originally planned to have the newest version of EJScreen version 2.2 out prior to this meeting. We hit a little bit of a hiccup and got a little bit of a week delay. So we should have the newest version of EJScreen out next week, rather than prior to this meeting as we had planned. This update that we're doing right now is not going to be as in-depth as some of the last couple updates that we have done to the tool. And as Dr. Chakraborty had mentioned, what you will be reviewing is the old version, not this version. This is just for your information as to some of the things that are changing. And so as of next week, when you get on the tool, you're going to see some different things, but your comments still should be focused around the old version of EJScreen. Is that what you had come on camera to say, Dr. Chakraborty? Okay. So I'm going to walk you through some of the big changes that we've made. As I said, we haven't made some very large changes as we've done in the past. Mostly this was an update to a lot of the environmental and socioeconomic data that underlie the tool. But we did make some changes that I'm pretty excited about. One of the things that we did do was the way that our EJScreen reports work has been revamped. So we did this to make the reports a little bit more accessible and robust. They're going to be easier to interpret for a lot of people. And we took a lot of the different elements of the reports and combined them into one single report. Prior to this, we had census reports from the ACS, from the decennial census, and then we had an EJScreen standard report. We've taken all those elements and meshed them together so that it tells a better story of what's going on in a community. Now you can look at our reports and you'll get data on the racial breakdown, languages spoken in the community, information on the household income, average household income. We now have information on health disparities, climate change, critical service gaps in our reports, which we didn't have prior to this. So, I think that those changes to our reports are going to be kind of a big deal. And it is our hope that it's a step towards the goal of helping people get a better understanding of all of the different cumulative factors that are impacting a community by having all of this information together in one report. The other big thing that we've done with this update is we're building in a new environmental indicator and corresponding EJ index and supplemental index. That's going to be the 13th environmental indicator that we built into the tool. This one is going to be called toxic releases to air, and it's based on risk screening environmental indicators, the RISI model, RISI modeled TRI data, toxics releases, the toxics release inventory. So that's a list of chemicals that are regulated through REPRA, and you know, a lot of the community knows of the TRI data because it is part of the Right to Know Act. So a lot of people have been asking us to build this data into EJScreen for quite a few years. I think it's going to be a really great addition to EJScreen. We're using that RISI micro data, so it's got very good granularity in communities. As I said, there's going to be a corresponding environmental justice index and a supplemental index that will go along with that. In addition to that, we have a few other new map layers that we've built into the tool. We've got a new map layer on cancer and persons with disability in our health disparities data sets. We've got new data in critical service gaps on housing burden. We have data on transportation access for the first time. And then finally, we have a new data set on lack of health insurance. And we built that in to replace medically underserved areas that we previously had in there. We found that this data on lack of health insurance is more granular and a little bit more meaningful. Finally, we built in some new data on facility compliance. That's something that a lot of communities have looked at because of EPA's ECHO tool. And so we've incorporated that into EJScreen as well. There were a couple of data sets that we were hoping to bring into EJScreen this year that we didn't get to bring in. One of those was extreme heat data. We had talked to y'all about this when we met in May. So that was disappointing, but it's something that we're going to work on, and we'll continue to get it in the future. But those are pretty much the big changes. Otherwise, it was just basically updates to the underlying data. So we've moved from the previously 2020 ACS data, which is the 2016 to 2020 ACS data. We are now using 2017 to 2021 American Community Survey data. And then we've also gone and we've updated all of the different environmental indicators that underlie the tool. So I will stop there and turn it back over to you, Dr. Chakraborty.
All right, thanks, Ty, for the useful update and overview. And again, reminding everyone once more that this is mainly for information only. So we will not be reviewing these new changes and improvements. Our report, as you already know, will focus on the version of EJScreen that was released last October. But we do have a few minutes for questions, just keeping in mind that we are only taking clarifying questions at this point. We are not having any discussion or deliberation. So questions from panel members and others attending.
This is Ari. I can't seem to raise my hand on Zoom, but I do have a question. Ty, when did you say the changes are already available right now? Or is it going to be very soon?
No, we should have that out to the public next week. We have the changes available internally to EPA, but next week those should be out in the public tool.
Okay. And is the RISI data just the RISI score, or is it some of the other information underneath it as well?
So
because of concentration, yeah.
It's the RISI microdata only for air. So they separated out all of the RISI data and only looked at the air related data sets. And using that microdata, we've scored all of the different block groups in the same way that we do for some of the other data.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Right. Feel free to raise your hand if you have any clarifying questions for Ty. All right. I don't see any raised hands at this point. So thanks again, Ty, for coming here and updating us on what's happening in the world of EJScreen version 2.2, and of course responding to the question that we had. So on
Thank you
that
for having
note,
me.
okay, thanks. Bye. On that note, I'll move on to the next item on our agenda for today, which is public comments. And I think Carolyn just mentioned that we do not have any registered members of the public here today to provide oral statements, right? So I just wanted to verify if that is still correct, if nothing has changed in the last 15 minutes.
That's correct.
Carolyn. Okay, thank you for clarifying. So moving on now to our main topic of discussion regarding the recommendations, and we do have a little bit of time. So let me begin with some reminders and some general issues, items to keep in mind before we get started with the topic category number 1. So our panel, our main job here is to focus on the recommendations for each of the 16 charge questions. PowerPoint presentations with the tiered recommendations extracted from the integrated draft responses document will be used to keep our deliberations, focused and organized. If any panel member wants to include additional recommendations for any of our charge questions, they will need to bring it up when we are discussing that specific question. And we will seek agreement or consensus as we move from question to question, from 1 through 16. And a few additional items for us to consider throughout the meeting, and especially when we start writing the draft, which is, the next step. The first item is about the recommendations that are kind of research-based or about things that are not yet developed. Because some of the panel's recommendations are kind of broad research-based actions or recommendations to utilize a data set or a tool that is not yet developed or not currently available at the block group resolution or not currently available nationally. So as we deliberate and write the draft report, we should keep track or note these recommendations for research or development by the EPA or others outside the agency. And this is really important because our report has the potential to inform the EPA's strategic research action plans for EJ science or environmental justice science. So eventually the SAB will take this report and present it to the EPA administrator and the agency. So there are these broad issues and research focused research or data set related issues that are not possible right now, but something that we should keep track of, or at least recommendations for further research are important to include, and I will discuss that in a bit more detail later. And also regarding minority or non-consensus recommendations, throughout the integrated draft, you'll notice that there is language such as the SAB urges, encourages, or suggests. These are recommendations for the EPA to consider and offers the opportunity for the EPA to explore or investigate the recommendation. This also provides the panel the ability to recommend different approaches to the agency for their consideration, leaving it to, of course, the EPA's discretion. So this might not be appropriate for every charge question, but can be one strategy to incorporate multiple panel members' opinions in areas where the science or approaches within the scientific community are still evolving or at kind of at an early stage. Another strategy, if one or a few panel members have opinions that diverge from those of the majority of the panel, we can mention this in the report that there is a minority opinion and include the justification for the opinion as an appendix. If this happens, the panel member will be responsible to to draft the justification and send their opinion or recommendations to the lead writer. And again, as we've said before, whenever you send something to the lead writer, make sure that you CC the DFOs and myself also. And in terms of this meeting, we have to stay focused on the charge question being discussed in all times and the recommendations related to that charge question. And as a reminder, there will be content within the integrated draft responses that will require further elaboration, modification, or editing after this meeting. And this is also a task that the lead writers and the assigned panel members will have time to work on between today and our meeting in August. And in terms of the role of lead writers, and something we have, I think, discussed already in one of the memos, for each charge question, the corresponding lead writer today will be asked to read the charge question and recommendations described on the PowerPoint slide. They will also be asked that for each charge question, to keep track of changes agreed upon collectively, and the panel members will be submitting follow-up language. Although it will be the responsibility of the individual panel member with changes requested to submit language to the lead writer, they should always, CC the DFOs and myself, as I mentioned before. I think those are the items I wanted to briefly cover. And again, some of it will be discussed again when we go through the various topic categories and the questions. But we'll begin our discussion by reading topic category number 1. And if I can have that PowerPoint, I think the second slide, right, is topic category number 1. That's it. Scientific defensibility and logic of the EJScreen calculations. I mean, this includes, as you can see, charge questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm not going to read all the charge questions, but I'm going to invite David Kuniski, the lead writer, to read charge question 1 and the recommendations for the charge, which comes up on the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Good morning, everybody. So I'll begin, I guess, with charge question 1, which you see on the screen. Charge question 1 says the EJScreen, EJ, and supplemental indexes are designed to examine the intersection of environmental pollution and community vulnerability. Please comment on whether the calculations achieve this goal using a method that is logical, clearly articulated, and scientifically defensible. Do you have any specific suggestions for how to improve the calculations?
The next slide will please. Okay.
Yeah, I see it. Jay, do you want me to go through all the recommendations at the start, or do you want to go one by one? What's the protocol here?
One by one would be nice, yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with tier 1, the major recommendation. The SAB recommends that the EPA continue to use its revised calculations for the EJScreen tool, specifically the EJ and supplemental indexes. The SAB recommends that the EPA better articulate its justification for the methodology in its technical documentation and other EJScreen support materials. Should I stop there? Are we just taking comments, questions as we go?
Yeah, I'll wait for you to, go through the whole slide.
Oh, go through the whole slide. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought I wanted me to go one by one. Okay, sorry. Tier 2, short term. The SAB recommends that the EPA reconsider its measurement of income. The current measure of income used in EJScreen is twice the federal poverty line. The SAB believes that this representation of income does not adequately capture geographic differences in income across the country. Second tier 2 recommendation, the SAB finds that some important factors impacting vulnerability are not included in the current EJ and supplemental indexes. For example, age has important implications on health vulnerability. Disability is included in the latest EJ definition in the Executive Order 14096 on revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all. The SAB recommends that the EPA consider adding younger and older age, as well as disability status, to the supplemental index. Furthermore, the SAB recommends removing low life expectancy from the supplemental index and perhaps moving low life expectancy to a separate list or adding more health indicators to the supplemental index. Tier 3, longer term. The SAB finds that the removal of population weighting is an improvement over the previous methodology, but that the EPA should consider offering population weighting as an option in EJScreen. In certain use cases, population weighting may be useful to highlight communities where improvement in environmental justice can benefit more people. And then a second tier 3 recommendation. The SAB concludes that the weighting of indicators is not currently feasible due to lack of scientific evidence, and that the EPA should continue to assess the impact of indicators to confirm that the most impactful indicators are being used in EJScreen and in the calculation of all indexes.
Okay, thank you, David. I will now request feedback from the panel members assigned to topic category 1 only. So panel members assigned to topic category 1, if you have any questions, clarifications, or feedback. And I guess David himself as well, the lead writer, can also provide additional feedback. Anything to add or?
I think this is a great summary. Ashish Sharma here from University of Illinois. I think this is a great summary. One quick clarification question is, we are providing these recommendations, or are we also providing methodologies to include these things as well, or just these things should be included or not included? Sorry, was I audible?
I heard you, Ashish. This is Anne.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Dr.
I heard.
Dr. Chakraborty, either I could clarify that, or you could.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, for further elaboration, that content can be included in the draft report in the body of the text. So this recommendation, it's ideal to have further elaboration and recommendations of methodologies for the EPA to explore. So these recommendations are just the broad action items for the EPA. And then when the draft report is developed off of the integrated draft responses to the charge questions, that's where further discussion can be included. And Dr. Chakraborty, if you need to clarify that any further, or if you agree with that, please let us know.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
And let me first get feedback from panel members assigned to topic category 1, and then I'll open it up for discussion with the full panel or rest of the panel. Anyone else that was part of preparing the feedback for question number 1 or topic category 1?
I guess this is Marjorie Alien. I just wanted to make a quick comment that I thought that David did a really excellent job putting this together. It's very clear. And in light of Ty's earlier comments about what the feasibility of certain things and within the purview of the group, it seems that, and please, it would be helpful for others to chime in, that these recommendations seem to be within the context that would be appropriate in terms of what Ty's comment was. But if others have a comment on that, I'd be interested in hearing others from the group first. Thank you.
Yeah, James.
This is Jim Sad. I had a question about the definition of disability. What exactly does that mean, and where does that data come from? I'm asking this question because disability is a very broad term. There's lots of different sorts of disability, and I'm not sure that all of them increase the vulnerability of people to environmental hazards.
Yeah, I think if I may speak on behalf of David and the others, I think they're referring to the census or ACS definition of disability, but you can correct me from the original set of integrated responses. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a specific answer or that we clearly articulated it in the document. I think this came out of our conversation in the May meeting more than anything, where we were reminded of this new category, because characteristic that was included in the updated EJ definition. So I think it got incorporated for that reason. I don't know that we got as far as thinking through exactly what measure it would be. I guess my reading of this recommendation is that it's something the EPA will likely have to figure out anyways as they broaden the definition. So this is stated kind of openly for them to do that in that context. At least that's my read, but if others think we need to be more specific, we can certainly make a modification.
Yeah, Ashish Sharma here. I think if we look at the executive order, they, to the best of my knowledge, they do not really specify in detail what it means. They have added these terms there, and I think that is what the federal agencies have to determine what those specifically means and how they should be included. But as EJScreen is a federal screening tool, we thought, okay, it should be part of our broader EJ indicators.
Okay, this is Jim Sad. It seems to me that age is very different than disability. It's a biological measure. It's a biological vulnerability indicator, and there's good scientific evidence and understanding of the relationship of age and vulnerability, particularly to air pollution. So I'm wondering if this language could be edited in order to incorporate age, immediately or very quickly, maybe raise it to the tier 1 level, and then have EPA examine all of the issues and questions related to disability separately.
And do you have a related comment?
Yes, two comments. On the tier 1 major recommendations where the italicized, it says statement needs clarification. I recall that our conversation, if we just add the statement after methodology, so articulate its justification for the methodology and more clearly differentiate between the EJ index and the supplemental index in its technical documentation and other EJScreen support materials. I'm not sure if that's what was meant, but that's what I'm remembering what was meant. Is as we discussed in the May meeting, there was some, and we do go into that distinctions, possible ways of distinguishing and providing recommendations, either a color scheme, a differential color scheme between the EJ and the supplemental index to provide differentiation before them. So that's one suggestion on just how that statement is clarification. And then possibly, I'm trying to look for the reference, but I can't find it, relating to the disability definition. I believe there's, if Title VI includes some, or when there's non-discrimination things, it looks at the Americans with Disability Act. So possibly that could be incorporated into that.
David Rojas.
Hi, yeah, David Rojas here, Colorado State University. I agree with the Jim said comment in terms of age, so that this provides a more biological susceptibility and should be considered more as a primary factor, and in distinction to disability, that is an independent effect. Thank you.
Right. And let me see if Sokovi here.
I think it's important to definitely differentiate between the two. I just want to note, and this is a discussion we had, Jay, with Paul Moha in the report that we did for the EPA US EPA EJScreen. I believe Paul mentioned that when you think about age, at least when we did the analysis, above 65 contributed nothing. What was it? Wasn't that the point that Paul made, Jay, that we may want to not include above age 65 in the as
Yeah,
an
he
indicator?
wanted to put the bar a little higher in terms of older age, and where it begins. No, so
Yeah, just wanted to say that, but I do agree that we should have some age-related indicators within the tool. Thank you.
So just to keep track of the recommendations that have been suggested, do we, I guess, one of the things that I'm not sure if we can do, we already heard from Ty that they are included a disability variable in version 2.2 in the upcoming version, which hasn't been released yet. But we cannot use that information, I guess, when we are making the recommendations. Is that correct, Carolyn? Let me just check with the DFOs, right? So.
Yes, this should be based off the 2022.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so but we do have a recommendation, right, from, well, initially James and which others contributed to, in terms of seeking more clarification and also moving it as a tier 1 recommendation. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I think that's what I heard as well. I guess let me say two things. One, like I think as written, this doesn't. Again, this is like the paragraph on age that also has disability. It simply asks or recommends the EPA to consider incorporation of age and disability, right? It's not. So I think it's pretty loose language. So if the EPA were to, I guess to your point, Jim, if they were to determine disability is not adding in the same ways in terms of vulnerability, then they would have the flexibility to make the determination and not be inconsistent with the recommendation. They're not written to be, they're in the same paragraph, but maybe they should, that's implying more than I think was intended, right? In terms of their importance. So we could, I'd be in favor of moving age up to a tier 1. If that's, if there's consensus around that, that is fine. I found these tiers a little bit, I mean, this was a first attempt. So I'm happy to do that. I might also recommend income being that same category. This is to another suggestion. As I reread this, I thought that the income point was also quite important. Maybe that could be moved to a tier 1 as well. I'd like to put that on the table.
Yeah, thanks for your excellent summary, David. So do we have consensus on what David just summarized? Anyone who disagrees? Okay. Okay, David, and those involved with charge question 1, it seems like we do have consensus, which means that we'll make note of the new recommendation, and if you need follow-up, you can. You're authorized to consult the individual panel members who raise the issue later. Okay. And just want to confirm with Carolyn, that's the correct protocol, right?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I just want to know, I didn't mention Anne's suggestion, which I think is correct. So we can also incorporate that into the language for tier 1, where that section where it says need clarification. So I made note of that as well.
Yeah, what's currently tier 1? Yes, yeah, for that sentence, yeah. Okay. So those are the two. And well, I'm supposed to also open discussion the full panel, but I think we've done that already. Unless there are any other individuals who have something to add to charge question number 1. Okay. And so just okay, so I think we can close discussion on question number 1 by asking once again if someone is objecting to the consensus for question number 1. If there's no one objecting or in disagreement, we can move on to the next charge question, which appears on the next slide. David.
Charge question 2. The EJ and supplemental indexes are designed to examine the intersection of environmental pollution and community vulnerability. Please comment on whether the calculations produce intuitive and expected results toward that goal. Recommendations. There was not a specific tier 1 recommendation in the original, in this draft document. Tier 2 The SAB recommends that the EPA reconsider and further justify the selection of socioeconomic indicators included in the supplemental index, and specifically the measure of a health outcome such as low life expectancy. A second tier 2 recommendation, the SAB recommends that the EPA consider conducting empirical analyses across methodological updates at EJScreen to identify communities with considerable changes in EJ index and supplemental index between versions. The EPA should also consider conducting empirical analysis between EJScreen and state-specific EJ screening tools to assess alignment of the same communities across community score across different platforms tools. Tier 3, the SAB recommends that the EPA invest in an effort to systematically ground truth key environmental inputs utilized in the EJ and supplemental indexes to ensure that the percentile scores created in the calculations reflect situations that individuals, households, and communities themselves experience. A systematic ground truthing effort also has the potential benefit of providing communities with opportunities to provide additional information for inclusion in EJScreen. And then a second tier 3 recommendation, the SAB notes that one important consideration is for the EPA to provide technical infrastructure and related resources to support communities in the ground truth activity and to avoid putting extra burden on the communities. Ground truthing is best accomplished by selecting a variety of location types, including urban and rural examples. The SAB encourages the EPA to document this ground truthing effort and present it as case studies.
All right, excellent. So we'll begin once again by seeking feedback from panel members assigned to topic category 1. And I'll call on the individuals who raise their hands. Again, look first with panel members assigned to topic category 1, and then opening it up for all remaining panel members. Okay, so it looks like there are no additional comments, feedback. Okay, we do have Anne and then Veronica.
Thank you. The second long-term recommendation, I would ask or suggest that add in a statement. I'm trying to look at what my Word doc is and what's on the slide to make it right. The SAB notes that one important consideration is for EPA in collaboration with the states to provide technical infrastructure and related resources. If we're ground truthing things, the states would hopefully know their communities best. And so having that state and local partnership with EPA to provide those ground truthing activities would further both the state's capacity, the community's capacity, and EPA's capacity. So that's my rationale, but just adding the simple statement of after EPA in collaboration with the states to provide technical infrastructure and related resources.
Okay, so I think I'm supposed to ask if we have consensus on that change that Anne suggested. Or if someone does not agree. Okay.
Dr. Chakraborty?
Yeah.
This is Carolyn. Just one note, since we do have members listening in, it might be useful for when seeking consensus to just ask for an audible aye or a second from one panel member, just to help for those listening in.
All right.
Or one or more panel members.
Okay, so all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Thank you. And Veronica, did you have a different comment or question, or?
Yeah, it
You're
was
welcome
not
to speak.
about the recommendation. It was just
Okay,
about
go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
in the second recommendation, there is a reference to the low life expectancy. And in the charge question, I think 5 or 6, there was a comment about the low life expectancy. So I was wondering whether that should be moved to the text that follows this charge question too, given that the low life expectancy indicator is mentioned here. So it was just that question / comment.
So your suggestion would be to move that here or move this to
Yeah,
question?
so in the
Okay.
charge question 5 text, there is
Yeah, I'm
some
looking at it. Yeah.
recommendation. I don't think it is in the slides. It is in the draft document. So I was just suggesting
Okay.
that recommendation with changes to how the low life expectancy is calculated be moved to the discussion under charge question 2.
And David, you had a question too.
Yeah,
David
well,
Kenneth.
yeah, let me respond to that and then I guess it's
Sure.
related. So I think there's a lot of overlap throughout the document in terms of in redundancy in some ways. So I don't know if that's something that has to be reconciled or not. But I guess here, I think the point is less about measurement and more about selection and justification. So to me, they're kind of somewhat different points. So I'm okay with it being reflected here because I think it does speak to the charge question too. A question, and then depending on the answer, maybe a suggestion. When we put these together, I guess it wasn't clear to me whether or not we needed to have for every charge question a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3 set of recommendations. If that's the case, and I might put on the table that we move this first bullet point under tier 2 to the tier 1 major category instead. If we don't need to have a major recommendation, then it's probably okay where it is. But so I guess that's part of question and part of suggestion, depending on the answer to the question.
So your recommendation is that we move the first bullet under short term or tier 2 to tier 1 as major.
Yes, but kind of under the only, I mean, I don't feel that strongly about it unless there is a need to have a tier 1 recommendation under each charge question. So that's kind of my.
Yeah, I think just for consistency, that would be a good idea. But...
Yes, then that's my recommendation. We make that one up tier 1.
So all those in favor of moving the first bullet under tier 2 to tier 1?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Aye.
So yeah.
Dr. Chakraborty, do you mind if I just provide a quick clarification?
Sure.
So perfectly fine, of course, to move things around and whatever the panel wants to do with the tiering, but there is no requirement from our side to have a recommendation under every single tier. So if with some charge question, the panel doesn't actually have a major recommendation, then that is okay from the perspective of the EPA, or if the panel doesn't have a recommendation for a short-term effort, that is also okay from the perspective of the EPA. But if Dr. Chakraborty and the panel wants to make sure they include, one for each tier, it's up to you all. But from our perspective, it is okay if a certain tier doesn't have a recommendation associated with it.
So we have Marjorie and Anne next.
I just wanted to suggest that it despite Carolyn's point, which is helpful, that is appropriate for the tier 1, and it might even suggest that it be limited to just the first part of the sentence and not include specifically the measure of a health outcome such as low life expectancy. Because I think in general, it is important that EPA reconsider the selection of the indicators. And I think that's a point in itself. And then it might also relate back to the previous comment about the low life expectancy being in multiple places. And so further elaboration of the low life expectancy can happen in another part of the document.
Anne?
This is Anne Fritz. And going back to what Ty's recommendations and ask of this panel is, if we think about, and I was thinking about things as being the tier 1 as doable, immediately doable within current or next term finances and staffing things too. So if you look at it as achievable, that could be another way of looking at it. And then also, if we have a lot of things that, if every single one has one, then somehow or another there might have to be a priority, or there might be ones that are more easily achievable within a budget cycle than others. So that's potentially another consideration on whether or not to put stuff in, to shift it around into the tier 1s, tier 2s.
Anyone else on the panel or rest of the panel not involved with topic category 1 who wishes to comment or provide feedback? Okay, so just to quickly recap, we are talking about basically one change to the responses for this charge question, moving that bullet to tier 1, right? And I just wanted to double check that we still have consensus that the consideration or justification of socioeconomic indicators in the supplemental index is a tier 1 or major recommendation. Or can I get a yay, nay, one last time?
It's okay with me.
Yay.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so we are now ready to move on to charge question number 3.
Okay, charge question 3. EJScreen combines environmental and socioeconomic information into EJ and supplemental indexes to examine the intersection of vulnerable communities and pollution. Please comment on whether the use of both EJ and supplemental indexes in EJScreen is logical, whether the differences between these indices are clearly documented, and whether the documentation clearly indicates why both of these indices are used in the tool. Initially, there was no tier 1 recommendations. The first tier 2 recommendation, the SAB recommends that the EPA update the EJScreen technical documentation to better justify the rationale for the calculations used in the supplemental index, including the choice of indicators for inclusion and exclusion. In updating the technical documentation, the EPA should articulate for what purposes the EJ index should be used and for what purposes the supplemental index should be used, recognizing that EJScreen has multiple user types. The EPA should also continue to emphasize the importance of EJScreen as a screening level tool. A second tier 2 recommendation, the SAB recommends that the EPA update the EJScreen technical documentation, specifically the terminology around the EJ and supplemental indexes, to ensure it is clear and consistent. As part of these updates, the EPA should reconsider the labeling of the indexes so they are more intuitive to multiple user types. Tier 3 recommendation, the SAB recommends that the EPA carefully compare calculations of the EJ and supplemental indexes to identify areas of divergence and to use that comparison to inform when each index should be used by different users.
Okay, so comments and feedback first from those involved with this charge question and topic category, including David.
Yeah, I guess I'll get started. The only thing I would suggest changing would be to move the first bullet point under tier 2 to tier 1. And reading it again, I think was a pretty important conclusion. And I'd like to see that given a little bit more emphasis. Thanks.
Okay. I agree, but I'll wait for the others to respond to that suggestion.
Aye.
Aye.
All right. So Marjorie, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just quickly, I mean, I think this is a case too, where in the one bullet, there may be sort of two different concepts. And I'm just wondering whether both of those would be moved to tier 1 or, one being to justify the rationale for the calculations and the other, the purpose that the indices should be used. And so I'm just wondering if it would be better possibly to separate those out as separate bullets and to move the one, or whether both should be moved to tier 1 as individually.
Any follow-up questions or comments?
This is Anne. I think the whole entire the two concepts that are captured in bullet 1 are both important. Is document, better justify the rationale for those two different indices, and then as well as the purpose, the why. I think both are equally important. So in my opinion, I think that whole entire bullet, although it does contain two different concepts, is valid to be a major recommendation. I might also suggest, it does mention it in the technical documentation. They refer to sometimes the EJ index as a 2-factor index and the supplemental index as a 5-factor index, so that in the larger body of the report, as a suggestion for distinguishing, because I know that was one of our other comments, is distinguishing between the EJ index and the supplemental index. And I believe that might be another question later on, but that's one possibility to distinguish between the two.
David Kuniski.
Yeah, this is David. I just wanted to, I agree with your recommendation to move the whole paragraph to tier 1, but also split it into 2 bullet points. I think that makes good sense.
Do we have consensus on what David just said? All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Excellent. Yeah, it is a really good idea. So unless there are any other comments, questions, feedback, we'll move to charge question number 4.
Charge question 4, please comment on whether the EJ and supplemental index calculations use an appropriate balance of socioeconomic and environmental consideration in the equations. Do you have recommendations on how they could be improved? So at present, there's no tier 1 recommendation. Tier 2 recommendation, the SAB recommends that the EPA continue to review data sets from other federal agencies, such as the USDA and CDC, to identify potential additional indicators that could complement the current supplemental index indicators, in particular for rural areas. Tier 3, because the use of weighting factors for indicators is so complex and not currently feasible, EPA should maintain its use of equal weighting of socioeconomic and environmental indicators as part of the EJ and supplemental index calculations. However, the EPA should consider adding more indicators to better capture rural geographies, Native American communities, and specific racial and ethnic groups. However, when adding indicators to the demographic and supplemental demographic index, EPA should take extra caution that differences in one indicator do not dilute the contribution of other indicators in the indexes. Second tier 3 recommendation, the SAB recommends that EPA consider the inclusion of additional indicators and indexes, such as a health index, as part of future updates of EJScreen. And a third tier 3 recommendation, the SAB recommends establishing a systematic collaboration with other federal agencies and state partners to discuss data resolution issues and potential databases for inclusion of into EJScreen.
Yes, Marjorie.
Yeah, I think this is just additional recommendations for kind of moving things around. But it seems that the tier 2 recommendation might be appropriate to move up as a major recommendation. It actually comes forward in a couple of places in this document. And then a second recommendation might be that under the tier 3, the second bullet about considering inclusion of additional indicators could be moved up into tier 2, because in some ways that could be, I think, done on a shorter term basis than some of what we have included as long-term considerations.
Thank you. Sakobi?
Yeah, I just wanted to co-sign on what Dr. Leon just said. There's other state level tools that already have health indices, so we were a little slow making it a long term. So that short term, I'm not sure what short term means. Like, is that like this month or in a year? But definitely we should do that.
Yeah, thank you, Sakobi. Any other changes, edits, recommendations? And
Again, I'm thinking back to Ty's comments at the beginning about what is under the authority of EPA versus other federal agencies. And I am looking and thinking of CDC's social vulnerability index and things like that that include health indices. And so I guess I just have, while it's certainly important, I see other agencies that are including this. And so in partnership with EPA's things. So I'm struggling with that. There's one tool that does it all. So I guess what I'm saying is that while I do not disagree that this health index is an important thing to have in there, I'm almost thinking that the systematic collaboration, it's kind of putting the cart before the horse. I would prefer to see the systematic collaboration first to make sure, and then things are included.
so just to clarify, you don't think that's a tier 1 recommendation, right?
At this, well, continue to review data sets. I do think the one that's in the tier 2 in the short term, I think, yes. And I guess what was the other? Now I'm confused about where we're moving things.
I have to go back to David Kaniski.
I think that, I'm sorry, just the suggestion that I made about moving things and that was right. The first thing that you said about moving the tier 2 to tier 1, just continue to review data sets.
Okay.
And then
yeah, and that sounds good.
And then the second suggestion would be to think about that tier 3 second bullet. And again, it's to consider the inclusion of additional indicators. Might be moved up to the short-term tier 2, just to clarify my comment.
Okay, thank you. And I guess that's what I was thinking of, is that you have to collaborate with the other agencies that are potentially doing the health indices, like the CDC.
Yes, I think you mentioned this.
Yeah.
the CDC's Environmental Justice Index has a set of health indicators.
Yeah.
At the census tract level, however, but yeah. Okay.
I might just note that, I mean, the current tool already has some health indicators, right? So it's not as if this is a brand new effort. So I think the ask is that others be considered. One possibility would be to combine those two bullet points to emphasize that this should be done in collaboration with other fellow agencies. That's a possibility. If and then move it all to tier 2, if that would address your.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, because a lot of times what we're seeing is that there's a lot of asks of the states, but then no guidance provided. And so we'd prefer some collaboration and ask first. And so I see the collaboration and the discussion and then the inclusion. And you're right. Yes, there are already health indicators on there. David, that's a great solution.
All right. So all those in favor of making that the main change for this slide or for this charge question, can I get a yes?
Yep.
Yes.
Aye.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so that's it for topic category 1. Thank you, David, and others in this group again for coming up with a very useful and important set of recommendations, and that we have, had consensus on. And on that note, we'll move on to the next slide and topic number 2, which focuses on technical accuracy of the EJScreen methodology and includes charge question 5, 6, and 7. And for this section, at least in the integrated responses, it was good to see the layout, how Veronica and other group members have arranged the section, specifically the topic headers. I think that's kind of along the lines of what the final report may look like eventually. But I'd like to invite Veronica to read charge question 5 and recommendations for the charge.
Yes, thank you. So charge question 5, EJScreen represents the tools, indices, and indicators as percentile to show how a given location compares to the rest of the state or nation. Please comment on whether the methodology for use of percentile to represent the various scores is logical, clearly articulated, and scientifically defensible. So at the moment, there is no tier 1 recommendation, and tier 2 recommendation. I think here there has been a little bit of miscommunication in the report. So I think the major tier 2 recommendation is to improve the interpretability of the EJScreen indices and indicators for the intended users of the tool, local communities. And then these next 2 bullets are basically ways to improve this interpretability, improving the interpretation of percentiles provided in the technical documentation, providing better visual representation of the percentiles by using a more appropriate color scheme and relaying additional useful information. For tier 3, long-term recommendation, incorporate or account for the inherent uncertainty in the raw data when deriving percentiles for EJScreen indices and indicators. Another recommendation is to develop a more appropriate approach than the current definition of percentile used for EJScreen supplemental indices or indicators that involve multiple demographic variables. Another recommendation is to consider a finer spatial resolution or a more well-specified comparison group when calculating percentiles for EJScreen indices and indicators. And then there is also another one in the next slide that says, consider an improved approach that allows a comparison between percentiles for different indices and indicators of different natures simultaneously. And then there are additional consideration that are not part of the recommendations, but I think this is where there was the consideration regarding the low life expectancy indicator.
Okay, so thanks for the summary. We will now begin with feedback for panel members who are involved with this topic category number 2 and charge question 5 in particular. And then open it up to all other panel members if they have any feedback or recommendations. All right, so looks like we do have consensus for charge question number 5. I just need a verbal yes for all those in favor of keeping it the way it is.
Yes.
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 All right.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We can move on now to charge question number 6.
Charge question 6. EJScreen uses buffers to consider the population surrounding a given location. Please comment on whether the methodology for considering affected populations using buffer analysis is logical, clearly articulated, and scientifically defensible. Do you have suggestions on how the buffer analysis methodology could be improved? So right now, there is no tier 1 major recommendation. And then for tier 2 short-term recommendation, there is improve the clarity of the technical documentation. And then a second recommendation is to provide more scientific justification for the decisions used in deriving proximity indicators. Tier 3 long-term recommendations are to address the temporal mismatch between the information from the decennial census estimates and the ACS 5-year estimates, to investigate the use of data sets that provide spatially resolved information on population density and population distribution for buffer analysis, to consider other quantitative aspects of population's environmental exposure besides distance when deriving proximity indicators, to enable users to add other data in various formats or apply different distance thresholds to enrich the list of environmental exposure or environmental hazards considered. And then to consider other qualitative aspects of a population exposure when deriving proximity indicators or when performing buffer analysis.
All right, thanks. So feedback from panel members involved with or contributing to topic category number 2. And opening it up now for any panel member who wishes to comment or provide feedback on any of these recommendations. And yeah, Anne, go ahead.
I just want to thank Dr. Barocco. It was nicely done. And actually all of the lead writers. I really appreciate the summary and the clarity of these. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Any other comments, feedback? I just wanted to double check with Veronica and the other group members whether you don't want to include any of the tier 2 recommendations as tier 1. You don't have to, but I'm just curious if you thought about that.
So for me, I felt that the majority of the comments that were made for both charge question 5 and 6 were more referring to the clarity of the technical documentation, which is why I thought that was a major recommendation, tier 1 for charge question 7, rather than for these other ones. But I don't know if that's the opinion of the other panel members.
Good, thanks. Okay, so yeah, Michael.
All right, I just wanted to add, I think there was general agreement between charge question 5 and 6 that the sort of scientifically defensible use of percentiles and buffers were sort of the major consideration, and we were in agreement with that. A lot of what 5 and 6 really referred to was, I would say, maybe add-ons to help improve the use of those calculations. So I agree that there are really no major tier 1 recommendations, but the others will help with improvements of the tool.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Any other comments or feedback? Looks like we do have consensus for the recommendations related to charge question 6. I just need a verbal yes or yay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
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 Thank you. We can now move on to charge question number 7.
So charge question 7, please comment on whether the EJScreen website and technical documentation are clear, accurate, and transparent. Do you have any specific suggestions on how to improve EJScreen documentation? So here we do have a tier 1 major recommendation, which is to differentiate between technical documentation and a user guide for a less technical audience. Tier 2 short-term recommendation, increase transparency with respect to the data used within EJScreen. And a second recommendation is to consider redundancy with respect to access to information. Tier 3 long-term recommendation, I think this is just more in terms of like the time that it might take to get to this recommendation. So tier 3 recommendation, to develop tutorial videos centered around specific case studies that are of relevance to local communities, and to conduct formal user testing involving the user interface team.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. So comments and feedback for panel members who are involved with topic category number 2. Feedback from any panel member, any of the other panel members? Anne, go ahead.
Thank you. Just one thing, it was in this particular, in the long term, there was a comment, detailed comments on the current version of the technical documentation with specific pages are located in the appendix. What is the recommendation? There was one thing that I noticed. It refers to just a couple of times, compare to US, compare to state, compare to region, but there actually is no compare to region button. And so it's listed. I guess, how do you want those recommendations? Should I add those to this and send it? Is that the best?
Yes, you can send it to the lead writer for the topic category, and make
Okay.
sure that you CC us as well, the DFOs and myself.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And any other comments, suggestions, feedback? Cindy, go ahead.
Thank you. I was just going back to the notes from our meeting. I think there was some mention around the extensive use of links in the documentation, and links to website could go outdated. So maybe that can be a, I don't know, short-term recommendation to, instead of linking to other source that could have invalid links, like include a more permanent way of citing those sources.
So do you want this to be, I guess, do you want this to be written specifically in the short, title of the topic, or this is, I think there is a discussion about those links that should not be used in the elaboration that follows this title of the topics. But if you want to have it explicitly mentioned in the topic headers, then that's fine with me as well. I just don't know what text you're suggesting.
I can think about a short sentence that's comparable to the other 2 bullet points on the screen and send it to you.
Okay.
Right. And just to clarify, Cindy, you can send the exact language to Veronica later, seeing us meeting, I think myself and the 2 DFOs later. But for now, I think we have to agree on that collectively, that this is an appropriate tier 2 recommendation, right? So do we have consensus on regarding Cindy's suggestions for including links or which become invalid over time as a suitable tier 2 recommendation? And I need a yes or no.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So, and then again, Cindy can work with Veronica to finalize the language that will go into the main report, as well as with regards to this recommendation. Okay, I think that's it for topic category number 2. So thank you very much, Veronica, and of course, and the team that worked with her to come up with these recommendations for charge questions 5 through 7. And so we'll move on now to the next slide, and the next set of charge questions that are listed on the topic category number 3, recommendations on the demographic and environmental considerations in the EJScreen equations, which comprise charge questions 8, 9, and 10. I would like to invite Dr. Sakobi Wilson to read charge question 8 first, which appears on the next slide, and recommendations for this charge question. And Sakobi, hope you're feeling a little better today.
Yes, I'm in my COVID recovery. Thank you. I'm echinacea, aromatherapy, everything I can do. I'm trying to make it happen. So yes, but feeling better. Thank you for that. So charge question 8. EJScreen averages data on low-income and people of color to form the demographic index, which is used to create the EJ indexes. The supplemental indices use an average of data on low income, unemployment, less than high school education, limited English speaking, and low life expectancy to form the supplemental demographic index. So we're supposed to comment on whether the demographic inputs used in the EJ and supplemental index calculation reflect the peer-reviewed literature and current understanding of the demographics on environmental justice, vulnerable communities. If there are any suggested additions, deletions, or other changes to how these 2 demographic indices are calculated. So right now, tier 1 major is currently listed. We do not have a tier 1 major recommendation. For short-term tier 2, the EPA shall use a sensitivity analysis, leverage the previous report done on US EPA EJScreen that includes a sensitivity analysis. Bring in additional demographic indicators, particularly when looking at rural communities. The EPA should capture homeless people, migrants, incarcerated individuals, indigenous people, Amish, Mennonite communities in single-family households in the demographic index, or bring in those indicators. Bring in more rural-specific indicators. The EPA should align the indices with the new executive order on environmental justice. Specifically, the SAB recommends that the EPA look at disabilities as a demographic indicator for EJ communities. And those are tier 2 short-term. Tier 3 long-term include a better indicator that captures indigenous populations in reservation and non-reservation settings, include another metric for indigenous people, maybe have an indigenous index separate that's available to pull in. The tool should allow for users to define what demographic index is included as a layer, or what maybe it should be what layers should be included in the demographic index. Also, develop more regionally specific demographic indices. Also, as a subset of that, engage impacted communities to help select appropriate demographic indicators and develop these indices. See national climate assessment regions as an example. Develop indices for each EPA region. And then there's a note to panel, table needed on the demographic index to list data sets and variables, and note if intended to be included as an index, separate layer, or both to be included in report.
All right, thank you.
That's a lot. You're welcome, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, so time for feedback, comments, suggestions from panel members who are involved with this topic category. Comments and feedback from other panel members.
Those who
David?
assisted. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, David Kaniski. Yeah.
Yes, I guess I just had a clarifying question regarding the bullets in under tier 2. I just want to be sure I'm understanding what the suggestion is. Is the idea to incorporate additional population groups in the index itself, right? Because the demographic index, as EPA defines it now, it just has people of color and then the income, the low income measure, right? And what this is suggesting is that they add homeless people, migrants, incarcerated, et cetera, to that index. Is that what's intended, or is it more to have those available as layers to look at in the EJScreen map?
Thanks for that. I think, and this may be on me, the reason why this is not clear. I believe in our discussions, we were going, if I remember correctly, we were going back and forth on that. So I think, and y'all can correct me on this, for many of these populations of concern to be included in the supplemental, but then as the conversation evolved, we were talking about different data sets and indicators that should be included and available. I think Dr. Alion had provided multiple really good comments in that regard, and others did as well, that we want to be able to maybe have modify the enhanced index, but then having additional layers. I think Dr. Alion mentioned, for example, very low income populations. That's one that we can really kind of zoom in a little bit more. But so just because of my note taking, I think from what the consensus was probably more on the end of the supplemental or the enhanced index, and not the primary demographic index. And others, again, it's having them as layers that people can add in. So not sure that was clear, David, but that was kind of our conversation. Sorry. Do others want to chime in on that point, the question of David?
I did have another clarifying question, a similar one for the next bullet under tier 2. For the rural specific indicators, are you referring mainly to environmental indicators for rural areas, or?
Yeah, I think that point is both relevant for environmental indicators, also specific demographic indicators. And then also, I believe in our conversation, which we'll get, I think, to maybe question 10. When we talk about the issue of infrastructure, so the discussion of infrastructure and resources came up a lot too. So those three areas, having more rural specific indicators for environmental, demographic, and also infrastructure resources. So we can separate it out, Jay, but I think that probably needs to be repeated in multiple places. Oh, excuse me.
Jim?
This is Jim Sad. Under tier 2, the third bullet, that is listed here as a short-term recommendation, meaning implement reasonably quickly, but is there data on many of these indicators at the block group level that could actually be implemented? I think some of them, the data probably either doesn't exist or the actual numbers can move so quickly that they wouldn't be time relevant to much of the other data in EJScreen.
Thank you for that, Jim. So I think as an amendment to this recommendation, we would need to separate out the ones that are readily available through maybe the census, which not many of these are. I think the single family households one is available. I believe in Jay's, in our meeting, Jay mentioned that incarcerated individuals, there is a data set that's available. I'm not sure about maybe from OSHA that may be migrant worker data, but others who talked about migrant workers can talk about that. But I think we need to speak to your point, Jim. Break them out, and some will stay in short term in tier 2, and then push the other ones to tier 3.
And before we go to Marjorie, I think once we have the table and the separation will happen then, and that will inform the text, right? I think that was the idea. Marjorie, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on David's comment, that's saying the tier 2 third bullet, where it has in the demographic index, or even if it were supplemental index, just thinking about the mathematics of how things are calculated. It seems like having some of those indicators included might dilute out the other indicators that are already there. And so I'm wondering about the consideration of whether those be included as part of these indices or as a supplemental information layer that can come forward. And that might work more in terms of how EJScreen is actually set up in some of the current calculations that I don't think are going to be changing anytime soon. And so I particularly where things are very small percentages across the country, like Amish or Mennonite, those are pretty specific communities and regional communities versus something like homeless people. But I think that for EPA to consider the best way to incorporate those homeless people, migrants, et cetera, incarcerated individuals, because I think it's a pretty complicated thing to do for various reasons already expressed in terms of whether the data are available and also just the mathematics of the index. I think that's sort of the major comment I'm trying to make versus supplemental.
Yeah, thank you for that. The representing this, the mathematics, I think the comment was made in the discussion, simple, J versus comprehensive. And then I think others talked about the need for, the mathematical discussion that we went into, and, that was clarified. And then also the need for a sensitivity analysis. So I would say that, I do agree that probably leaning towards at least having them available as additional, I like to use the term context layers, would be helpful, at least as a start.
Great.
Any other recommendations or suggestions? Okay, so looks like we do have consensus, on the general direction, I guess, of the responses to the charge questions, and including no specific recommendations for tier 1, right? Is that correct, Kobe? Or yeah. And so if we have consensus, just can I get a yes from some of you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. So move charge question number 9 next.
Here's question 9. Please comment on whether the use of an average of the demographic factors and the demographic supplemental demographic indices is appropriate and scientifically defensible. Details of the calculations can be found in the EJScreen technical documentation. Do you have recommendations on how these calculations could be revised to better address the target communities? So tier 1 major, still in progress. Tier 2, first bullet, use of the average of the demographic factors is appropriate and scientifically defensible. However, there has to be notes that by averaging indicators, that can be of different ranges. There's the potential of massive variability in the smaller indicators. Therefore, the SAB recommends that the EPA conduct additional sensitivity analysis to factor to address this potential issue. Look at differences for indigenous people, also noted in charge question 8. The SAB recommends that the EPA provide clarity on the assumptions and limitations behind indicators. The SAB also recommends that the EPA provides clarity on what using the average means for the national comparison. And those are all the tier 2 short-term recommendations. Tier 3 long-term includes spatial statistical approaches that allow hotspots to be identified where demographic and environmental factors converge. That's a J. Chakraborty recommendation. If the EPA bullet 2, if the EPA brings in additional measures, the SAB recommends that work needs to be done on the communication to increase literacy in the use of the tool and feedback from the community of users. That's all for me.
All right, so feedback from panel members who contributed to this type of category first. And then we can open it up to all remaining panel members for their comments, feedback, recommendations. Okay, so do we have full consensus for responses for charge question 9? And I just wanted to double check with Sakobi that you don't think any of the recommendations belong to tier 1. Is that correct? You're unmuted.
Well, yeah, I was just excelling. No, it was no. I think they're tier 2. I don't think they're tier 1.
Okay, and you don't think the first bullet under tier 3 belongs to tier 2? Just clarifying.
No. I think that's probably Jay.
Fine
probably
with me.
Yeah, probably long term, but definitely needed based on our that series of different conferences we've had at the meeting about statistics and mathematics. I think it's part of that larger discussion.
Okay, so if there are no other comments or questions, we can move to officially reach consensus for responses to this charge question. All those in favor, please say yes.
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 Thank you. And we can move on to question 10.
Okay, question 10. Please identify other currently available nationally consistent environmental data sets that are germane in the issues impacting EJ communities, but not yet included in EJScreen. Please provide input on the efficacy of the current indicators in terms of highlighting issues relevant to EJ communities, as well as feedback on criteria to ensure future indicators meet this goal and are not duplicative of other existing data sets. So tier 1, the deliberation is still in progress. Tier 2, as you see in this list, everyone, all of our recommendations are short-term, and we may need to move those around a little bit. First bullet, national consistent data should be collected in a standardized, unified way. The SAB recommends that the EPA include documentation explaining how the data was collected, provide better documentation and justification of all data sets and indicators for the current tool. The SAB recommends that the EPA use census block groups and tracks that may be useful for urban areas, but other units of analysis that may be more appropriate for rural areas. The SAB recommends that the EPA provide rationale for why certain indicators that represent the conditions EJ communities experience should be were not included in the tool. If not included, why the indicators were not included in the main index or expanded index. The SAB recommends that the EPA develop criteria on how the data would be used, i.e. would the particular indicator be included in the main EJ index, expanded EJ index, or as a layer that could be added to demonstrate a particular distribution or visualize an environmental phenomena. SAB seeks clarification about how the EPA addresses regions of the country where the tool misses the phenomena that contribute to environmental justice for populations, for example, of the arid parts of Southwest and where people live in the borderlands. The SAB recommends the EPA team focus on scalability, interoperability, resolution, and scale. This will allow EJScreen to provide comparisons nationally, but also allow users to zoom in to see what is happening at a more granular scale. That's long. We do have tier 3. Sorry about that. Long term. The EPA should, so this is tier 3, y'all, long term. The EPA should include indicators that would not negatively impact the integrity, will not negatively impact the integrity of the percentile ranking or scoring methodology if a scoring methodology is developed in the near future. This will be beneficial for demonstrating areas with high vulnerability, burden, or risk. Criteria need to be developed on the type of indicators that will be included: data quality, data reproducibility, and data utility. The SCB recommends that the EPA evolve EJScreen into a national platform where users, including impacted populations, could access multiple tools, indices, indicators, and data sets. The SCB recommends that the EPA work through its inter and intra-agency partnerships to bring more relevant health data into the tool, i.e. Health and Human Services, particularly the CDC, and additional data from other agencies, including USDA, FEMA, NOAA, Department of Energy, and the USGS.
All right. Any comments and feedback from panel members contributing to this topic category number 3? Okay. Questions, comments, recommendations from other panel members? Yes, David Rojas.
Hi, just wondering, we provide a list of suggested data sets that exist. I don't know if that list of data sets are included in some form to the APA, because based on this list of recommendations, there is not mention of those listed suggested data sets that already exist. Thanks.
Jay, I think in the report, right, there's a list of data sets that were included, and also is there another charge question was additional list of data sets and agencies?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Well, Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, could you go back one slide, please? Yeah, for tier 2 short term, bullet point number 4, provide rationale for why certain indicators that represent the conditions. I would imagine they already have this language. I would say this is probably, I think that's a major. I think front loading that, getting that out there right away would give the EJScreen group cover for a variety of things. I think that's pretty major in my opinion.
Like tier 1?
In my opinion.
Let's hear what the others think.
I would agree with that. This is Anne.
Thank you. So the recommendation is move that particular bullet from tier 2 to tier 1. And let me check if we have consensus or if someone disagrees. This is the time to speak up. If not, all those in favor of moving that to moving that or classifying that as a tier 1 recommendation. David Koniski, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry to interject quickly. I guess I'm supportive of that, but I also am wary of giving EPA kind of a task that is too, how should I say it, too big in terms of justifying indicators that they didn't include. That's potentially an endless list of things. So I wonder if that instead could just read providing better justification for those that are included, just to try to make it reasonable.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So all those in favor of making the modification to the text and moving it to tier 1? Can I get yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think also just wanted to clarify, if the panel finds that for charge question 10, there are too many recommendations, we can determine which recommendations should go into only the body of the report, not on this list, so that can be done as well. Marjorie? Yeah.
Just following up a little bit on that comment, Jay. Tier 2, the first bullet, nationally consistent data should be collected in a standardized, uniform, unified way. I guess we never really, or I've never heard the definition of nationally consistent data, and haven't done a huge review of some of the databases to actually determine whether they are collected in a standardized, uniform, unified way, but that's my assumption. But I'm wondering if that is one bullet that maybe could be pulled out and put more in what your comment, if you want fewer bullets, because that does seem like an appropriate and a good thing to do. Like that is what nationally consistent data how they should be collected, but I'm not sure that it maybe not having it as a bullet, given all the other bullets that are more focused on the charge question, and that might be a suggestion. And also a question, actually, are the nationally consistent data that EPA uses, are they collected standardized, uniform, unified way currently?
I think it's a question for Ty that we can, find the answer to later. But I agree that would be a good example of something that can be moved to the body of the report, not necessarily on this list. And
it's aspirational, right? I mean, not necessarily. It's the goal, and that's what they've said they've done. That's why you see some data sets that haven't been included because things weren't nationally consistent or available across every state. But yeah, it would be good to get that clarity and have that up front as part of this is, like the main driver behind why we have these particular data sets and why we don't have these others. Jay, real quickly, I was thinking, does bullet 2 need to also be moved up to major? I mean, it's similar to bullet 4. They're related.
Yeah, I mean, what do the other group members?
I agree with that
feel?
too.
Yeah.
Anne, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just have a comment. And this kind of relates to, because we're recommending clarification within the documentation. I believe it was charge question 5 that said, is the technical documentation clear? And so these kind of relate back to that other one is, no, it's not always clear. And so this is fine tuning the clarity about the data sets that are used for the technical documentation. So especially like bullet number 2, include documentation, how the data was collected, and better documentation. So that I believe was in one of the other previous recommendations. So we can just strongly encourage, put a little bit more forceful language, seeing as how this provide clarity in the documentation seems to be coming up more than once in one recommendation.
Yep, good point. But the recommendation that we have now is move that bullet point to tier 1 as a second tier 1 or major recommendation. Is that correct, Sakobi? Or?
Yes,
yeah,
that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let me check if we have consensus in terms of the second tier 1 recommendation, moving the second bullet point, currently the second bullet point under tier 2. All those in favor?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other recommendations, revisions for responses to charge question 10? I don't see any other hands raised. So thank you, Sakobi, for doing this during a difficult time and for you. But I think we are now ready to move on to topic category 4, right? And which focuses on the incorporation of cumulative impacts and scoring and comprises charge questions 11, 12, 13. So I'd like to invite Jim Satt to read the charge questions and recommendations.
Yes, this is Jim Satt. So charge question 11 states that EPA introduced threshold maps to EJScreen in 2022 for the first time. These allow EJScreen users to look across all 12 indices at once, providing a cumulative outlook on vulnerable populations facing higher pollution burdens. Please comment on the suitability of threshold maps for examining the cumulative environmental and social burdens on a community. And the different tiered recommendations are as followed. Tier 1 major recommendation is that the SAB considers threshold maps to be a significant improvement to the EJScreen tool and recommends minor adjustments to improve the utility for an audience that has variable needs. In general, this recommendation includes options to aggregate values and calculate percentile rankings using additional geographic units, using color ramps to graphically indicate areas with increasing threshold exceedances, and building in more data access options. The Tier 2 recommendations are as follows. Excuse me. The SAB recommends that EPA allow users to export, in addition to a flat file of metrics and indices, the block group boundary files with descriptive attributes of the selected polygons, both in geodatabase and in shapefile format and KML format for Google Earth users. The next recommendation is that the SAB recommends that EPA improve maps utility when comparing selected block groups to one another by symbolizing the selected block group polygons with a color ramp with saturation associated with the degree to which the selected variables exceed the minimum bound. This approach could provide a crude way to differentiate the highest versus lowest attainment of the thresholds. The next bullet is that the SAB recommends that EPA expand the option to have percentiles calculated using national and state samples. And then continuing on to the next slide, the SAB recommends, these are long-term Tier 3 recommendations. The SAB recommends that EPA explore the possibility of adding individual environmental indicators, both main and supplemental, to the map. However, the SAB cautions this may not be feasible if it places too much variation in map symbology and makes the maps difficult to read and interpret. And then the final bullet is the EPA recommends that EPA explore and consider the possibility of adding the data and the index from the CDC Justice 40, which should be clarified as the Council on Environmental Quality's Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJEST, to the threshold map to provide an actual index with scoring of elements. Through the data from that tool, though the data from that tool is at the census tract level, the SAB finds this approach may better capture social burdens and non-environmental data on the threshold map. Moreover, EPA would not need to develop its own index to incorporate cumulative impacts. Using this data in the threshold map versus the places section of the tool would tie more directly the Justice 40 index to any cumulative impacts or burdens considerations in EJScreen. That was a mouthful. Okay, back to you, Jay.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, do we have comments, feedback from panel members who contributed to this topic category, number 4? Questions, comments, feedback from other panel members?
Sorry, I have a comment, please. On the third bullet under T2, Tier 2, that needs to be rewritten because you can already have percentiles calculated using national and state samples in EJScreen. And the text that was submitted was asking for the option be expanded to other geographic regions. So I'd be happy to take a shot at rewriting that if you want me to.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, noted.
And I also have a comment about the second bullet under tier 3. I'm a little bit troubled by saying that the CJS tool provides an actual index. It does provide an index, but I don't really know what actual means. But charge question 12 has a recommendation to as an option to display data from other sources using a map service or geoplatform. And so it actually incorporates the intent of this bullet point, but it's in the next charge question.
Okay.
So I guess I'm recommending that we just remove this bullet from charge question 11 and pass that to charge question 12.
Okay. So all those in favor of doing that, just say yes, so we can approve. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that change, okay. Thank you all. So that change approved. Moving this last bullet from tier 3 for question 11 to question 12 is where we are going. Esther, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, this is Esther. I was wondering if we might consider just framing or talking a little bit more about the second bullet that we are about to move, because I am not assuming that the CJS tool is going to be maintained for a long time, as long as the EJScreen tool has been. And so I worry that if a lot of time is spent in really kind of synergizing or incorporating the data, if that is no longer maintained, we might frame it so that they maybe look at the original data sources that CJS uses, since they don't collect their own data, I believe. And so that might make sure that, yeah, there's some longevity in some of our recommendations.
Ari? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
this is Ari. I agree with that. Also, so in this charge question, it's in the threshold map. So I think we're considering taking it out of the threshold map and maybe put it as a layer, but I don't think it should be much more than that, given the concerns just raised and just the fact that obviously they could go to that tool if they want more detailed information.
Right. Anyone else? Okay. So going back to Jim again.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify once again. So we are definitely not keeping it here, and we can talk about how this can be edited under charge question 12, right? That was the initial.
Yes. And,
okay.
And that addresses Esther's very good point as well.
Yep. So we can move on now to charge question 12. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, charge question 12. The agency is interested in creating a cumulative score within EJScreen. Please comment on the potential appropriate uses of a cumulative score in the tool. Tier 1 recommendations are as follows. The SAB recommends that EPA identify appropriate ways for EJScreen to inform users of cumulative effects. Second bullet, when EPA is defining specific terms that are expressed as numbers or one single value in EJScreen, such as a score, the SAB recommends that the agency use the term index or assessment instead, as it is both more accurate and prudent. Bullet 3, in the context of EJScreen, the SAB recommends that EPA develop an index that aggregates values into a single number. And there's some garbled grammar here, but a single number that is a reasonable and fair way to summarize indicator percentiles on a scale where the higher and lower values indicate greater importance for screening purposes. And the fourth bullet, if the agency decides to include some score or index or metric of cumulative impacts in the context of EJScreen, it needs to define key terms clearly to ensure their consistent use. The SAB recommends a comprehensive explanation of what such metric or indicator does, or does not say about the location or population to guard against misinterpretation.
Next slide, please.
Tier 2, the deliberations are still in progress, so we're not at consensus there. And then Tier 3, the SAB recommends that before EPA develop a single cumulative score or index, that there should be a well-defined purpose or question that this metric is trying to address. The SAB recommends that EPA evaluate the feasibility and utility of cumulative indices that are based on subsets of available indicators. These indicators could be organized into relevant categories to address a specific concern. This approach should be completed in close collaboration with states. Third bullet is the SAB recommends that EPA increase the prominence of the option to display data from other sources via a map service or geoplatform to help users think about cumulative impacts or cumulative effects within the threshold maps. And examples of that would be EJScreen, CGEST, the EDF proximity mapping, and others. And the final bullet, the SAB recommends that EPA include in the technical documentation a review of cumulative impacts analyses that have been done by the agency and others.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to remind the panel that, especially in this case, for example, tier 2, if we don't have full consensus, then any minority opinion can be included in an appendix, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. So just keep that in mind. Comments, feedback from any of the panel members who were involved with this topic category or contributed to this topic category or question? I don't see any hands, so we can go to panel members.
I had a comment.
Sure.
I mean, I think during our discussions during the meeting, I think we sort of emphasized that it was too mature and that the science really wasn't there to develop a single score. And I kind of don't feel like that's coming through in the major recommendations. It kind of seems like we should develop one here, and then in the tier 3, it's like, well, I think one of the tier 3 bullets, it says something about, there needs to be, before EPA develops a single score, there should be some well-defined purpose or question for that metric. That seems to be, I think, more in line with what we were saying, unless people don't agree, but I'm not remembering that correctly. But as I read this, it just seems like there's more support for a single score than we came away with at the meeting.
We have Jim, right? So, and
yeah, could we go back to the tier 1 recommendations? Well, actually, let's go to tier 2 because I wanted to follow up on that. I'm sorry. I agree. And I think that the first 2 bullets under long-term tier 3 should be combined together. And then perhaps that entire recommendation perhaps be moved up.
okay, so the recommendation is move those 2 bullets from tier 3 to tier 2. And Anne, and then Michael.
I agree with Ari's comment, is that it was my understanding on the discussion that it was a little premature to go ahead and develop a cumulative effects. And so some of the things that are listed in the tier 1 major, maybe it's not my understanding that those were tier 1 major, and that the first and second bullets, or first bullet in particular, is that before they develop a single cumulative score or index, there should be a well-defined purpose or question that the metric is trying to address. And that, to me, is a major goal. And if I recall right, I do believe there is some guidance that's in development right now, and I don't know if it's finalized. And some of those folks, you folks on the call might know if some of this guidance for developing these cumulative effects is what stage it's in, but it almost seems like these things have to be, we're asking them to do a lot and they're already doing a lot all at the same time. And so I think this, in short, I agree with Ari, is that I don't think that we want it on there as a major immediate goal, but it is that that number one bullet under long-term should move up for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's Michael next, and then Jacoby.
Yeah, I wanted to also identify what Anne had mentioned as well. I also sit on the Bureau of Scientific Counselors for the Office of Research and Development at the EPA, and it had been made suggestion to ORD to also look into developing a framework for a cumulative impact assessment. So I know it's specifically said here that the SAB recommends that EPA, but I also just want to also emphasize that it's not just, you know, Ty and Matt in the EJScreen office who are looking into this, but that it's really the agency-wide effort, because I don't think we want different offices to come up with different cumulative impact assessment methodologies, and this would be a much larger effort on the EPA. So I think that's intended in this. I just wanted to sort of voice it out.
Good point. We have Jacoby, and then Esther, and then Jim.
Yeah, thanks for that last point. So I think I said during deliberation that, speaking of that point, this is a cumulative impacts is a priority of the administrator. And so it's like basically just said all hands on deck kind of approach. And I also said during our last deliberations that I'm part of the NEJAC cumulative impacts work group. And so we are talking about cumulative impacts, you know, in that discussion. So that discussion should be informing, you know, what Ty and others will be doing with EJScreen. But as part of the minority report, I will say that, as I said before, Cal EnviroScreen has had a cumulative impact scoring approach for over a decade. The other state level tools that have had a cumulative impact scoring approach, the CDC EJ Index has a cumulative impact scoring approach. So for me, I don't think we should be in long-term mode. I mean, there may be a staffing resource capacity issue, but the EJScreen is a decade or more behind state level tools in actually looking at cumulative impacts, including New York EJScreen, et cetera. So I'll actually push back and say that more needs to be done in concert with what's currently happening with EPA to leverage the cumulative impacts discussion and framework development. But I would not put many of these in long term, in my opinion, because it's already happening and we're behind. I'm done, Jay.
Thanks. Esther?
Yeah, Esther here. I wanted to say I agree with Jacoby. I don't think it's premature for us to have this in even the long term. I would actually recommend moving it to major, because I think it is really important and immediate goal. And there is a clear purpose for what all of these, not just EPA, but all these other places, what people are trying to do, which is to capture the true burden on communities across the different media and the pathways of exposure, everything combined. And so I think that purpose is clear. It's just in the method of how to do it, we might be recommending, you know, because there is no clear way to do that easily, to perhaps look into it further and do more analysis and research. But yeah, I fully agree with what Jacoby said.
All right, thank you, Esther. The next person is Jim, right? Back to Jim.
Yes. I'm in agreement with what Anne said. And in don't agree with Esther and Sokobi, but I think one of the problems here is that if we could go back to the tier 1 page, these recommendations are not really representative of much of what was said in the longer version that was sent. And so I think that these recommendations all need rewriting. I think the first bullet just really doesn't make a clear statement that reflects what the panel members said and agreed to. And I think bullets 2 and 4 really need to be combined together. And bullet 3, the language also has to be improved to make sure that we're talking about if an index is developed, that it's for screening purposes, and to make it clear that it's not actually measuring anything or measuring impacts. But I think this is a difficult discussion, but I think first we need kind of a rewrite of the tier 1 bullets, at least. I'm happy to take a crack at that, or someone else could do that.
Thanks. Let me come back to that after we have heard from Ari.
Yes, I agree with what Jim just said. And I think one of the major things that we discussed at the meeting, spent a long time doing it, was, sort of that it was premature to have a single score, but we did discuss how to sort of break it down, or index, however you want to describe it, but to break it down into smaller pieces so that, I think my impression is that most people thought that may be more meaningful. So into smaller buckets and if you were going to have an index, kind of have it broken down, but that the use of a single score, not only I didn't think it was just methodologically difficult, but just proposed difficult interpretation and did not think it was as meaningful. So, and just I agree. Like, I was sort of surprised when I read the tier 1 bullets. I didn't feel like that reflected the conversation that went on at all.
Okay, thank you. So I have Sokobi and then Quinn.
Thank you for that. You reminded me of my use of the term buckets. Yes, we did talk about buckets or domains. And so to clarify my previous comment, to moving forward, yes, the state level tools are far ahead. I still think we need to move forward with doing some work because, again, as I said in that discussion, this is about communities. EJ is about communities. EJ is place-based. And so this decision-making about what to do and not do, it actually needs to be more informed actually by those who are most impacted, which I said before. But getting to the domains buckets discussion, I definitely agree 100%. That's a place to start. And you have templates with these multiple state tools of the types of how you can bucketize these various indicators. And EJScreen has, a set of domains. We have domains. We have a demographic domain. We have a new climate domain. We have a health domain, right? And we also, I think, discussed that maybe a need for some other domains down the road, like an energy domain. But yes, I think domaining and bucketing the indicators is a place to start. And that should be not easily done, but reasonably to do based on these other efforts that are already out there. So I will push for that to be as a short-term recommendation.
Thanks. We have Quinn next.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, a lot of good comments. Yeah, and I think one thing I was saying about 2 that maybe aren't in these recommendations are around the data quality challenges, and maybe those would fit in the longer term ones where, like, if we don't, have good measurements of data to do, to eventually have some kind of cumulative impact score, or even to have the small buckets, with just those scores, that maybe the long-term recommendations should talk about new data collection that could happen. Maybe that'll happen through, ECHO, like really new data sets that we collect. I just wanted to add that to this conversation. But yeah, I also think some of the longer term recommendations we have here now could probably be happening sooner too. So thanks.
Any other comments and feedback for modifications to responses for question 12? Okay, so going back to Jim, yeah.
I'm sorry. This is Anne. I just have a
Right,
clarifying
okay.
question. So I have a hard time saying yay or nay on these unless
We
Jim
haven't
had-
reached that stage yet for this question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I think well, by my count, there are 3 or 4 different but overlapping, recommendations that have been proposed. And I think the easiest way to sort it out, because Jim already has raised his hand and he volunteered to rewrite this charge question, right? I just wanted to hear from him. Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to rewrite it. And another suggestion I have is that under tier 3, the 4th bullet, I think that actually could be moved to tier 2. It's specific, it's doable, it is a lot of work, but I think that should precede any development of some sort of a value by EPA for EJScreen.
Okay. And since this one got a little complicated than some of the other recommendations, yeah, I propose that we reach a consensus about, in theory, I guess, about some of these changes. I think I counted 4 or 5 of them, overlapping ones for now, and then wait for Jim to rewrite it, and then we can proceed with the next. And I just want to double check with Carolyn if that's okay, right? We can agree to some of the changes, that were discussed without specifying them or repeating them, which would be a little too complicated for now.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, and also remember that if there are 1 or 2 members who disagree, if there is a minority opinion, it can be included in the appendix if they wish to, have it listed that way. So that's also an option for later.
Jay, I just have a logistics question. So I'm happy to do this rewrite. What is the logistics of how that's submitted? Does it go to you and then you would send it to everyone else? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, Carolyn, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, and just to clarify, anything that's sent to the entire panel needs to be posted online. So Dr. Sad, if you write this document and then Dr. Chakraborty, along with myself and my coworker Zaida, will share it with the panel and receive their feedback and then Dr. Chakraborty will take the lead in incorporating that into the draft. The thing we have to avoid is having any sort of deliberation offline. So we can't have the whole panel contribute and see each other's discussion because that has to be done in a public forum. So based on this discussion, it sounds like you all are getting close to a good direction where you can develop something that come August, we can present to the full panel and receive feedback and changes and really nail down what the recommendations are and if there's anything to be included in an appendix. Does that clarify the process moving forward?
Yes, I'm just anticipating because there's a lack of agreement on some substantive issues that it may take more than one event of trying to come to consensus. And so I'm wondering if people should be invited to comment in emails to me as I'm putting these things together so I can do my best to incorporate what people are thinking. I don't want to just rewrite these myself without having an opportunity to hear other views.
Yes, understandable. Let me double check on some FACA requirements and I can get back to you after the break on how best to move forward with this, where you can still receive feedback from the panel and make sure that everyone's opinion is incorporated. But I don't want to give you the wrong direction before I look into a few things for you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
But I think we can have a motion for general agreement with what was discussed and the specifics to be finalized later. So does that sound reasonable? And then can we get a yes on that in terms of what was discussed in the last 15 minutes, moving forward with specific changes based on that?
Yes.
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 Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so moving on now
Yes.
to the next charge question, 30. I think you're on mute, Jim.
Sorry. Charge question 13. One technical difficulty in creating a cumulative score is the weighting of environmental indicators. Please advise on specific approaches for combining the environmental indicators together into a single score, including how to appropriately weight the various indicators to represent the risk burdens more accurately. Please comment on methods to incorporate other factors into the score, such as climate, health, and social factors. So under tier 1, there's one bullet. SAB suggests the ability for individual users to apply customized weighting schemes, although the technical difficulties associated with those weighting decisions are significant. Tier 2 has one bullet. The SAB does not support any systematic weighting scheme at this time. In this regard, no change to EJScreen is needed at this time. And tier 3, the SAB recommends that EPA consider providing mechanism within the context of EJScreen where users can apply their own relative weights. That's essentially what was said in tier 1. The SAB recommends that EPA avoid specifying weights or providing any guidance on what weights might be appropriate, but might consider commenting that different states could and should apply weights differently. And then the last bullet, if EPA decides to weight indicators, which the SAB is not recommending at this time, comprehensive sensitivity analyses should be used to understand and scientifically justify the contribution of any one indicator at its relative weight on the overall score to avoid biasing the score by overweighting. It should also be clear that a high value for a score or index does not by itself demonstrate greater health or other impacts.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Comments and feedback from panel members contributing to this topic category number 4. Yeah, Jim.
Yes, as I mentioned before, the first bullet under tier 3 is essentially the same as the bullet under tier 1. So those two could be combined. I think we could discuss whether it should, what tier that should be under. And then I think that bullet 2 under tier 3 should be moved to major or tier 1. Those would be my suggestions.
And let's hear from the other panel members, especially if anyone disagrees with those suggestions. Esther?
I think I'm hesitating a little bit about how some of these are weighted because it seems to imply that I think we don't have any agreement on any systematic weighting or whatnot, but this seems to be more discouraging than that. Especially kind of think about tier 2, like the SAB does not support any systematic weighting scheme. Sounds like we're not supporting a weighting scheme. It might be more so that we don't have any agreement on it, but we can perhaps list the factors we're considering. And for those reasons, we don't have a recommendation at the moment, but these are some things to consider. Like, I wonder if that's a better way to kind of frame some of the differences in opinion.
So, I mean, the body of the report, you'll have more space to discuss that. So is that what you're referring to, or not in this bulleted list, but in the body of the report, elaborate on this, right? So
I think I would feel, I think I'd be okay with what's framed now, but would feel more comfortable if we said something along the lines of like, we don't have an agreement on any weighting scheme, but not that we don't support it.
Any comments or responses to that? Or any other comments or feedback? Ari?
Hi, this is David. Sorry, I'm on my phone, so I can't raise my hand. Sorry if I'm interrupting others. I guess I find something a little bit odd in the way the first tier 1 recognition is stated, because in the body of the report, we extensively say how there's no appropriate way to do weighting. And then we're saying it's not scientifically defensible. And then we're suggesting that we allow people to do it anyways, which seems to me a little bit weird. If we think if it's a bad idea, then why encourage the practice of it? I see the benefits in terms of giving users control, but if we don't think it's a good sound practice, then it seems a little bit unusual to then ask EPA to incorporate it into the tool. Thanks.
Okay, let's hear from Quinn and then Ari.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, I think I was kind of thinking initially, I think what Esther was saying, I agree with, like, we have to sort of discuss the different approaches still, though it's not just like we don't ever support some kind of weighing scheme. And I think we had that kind of deadline to send an email with thoughts like to the lead writers last month, and I brought up a sensitivity analysis that California did, and they nicely laid it out, and I suggest we maybe add that as a reference in the body of the report. Yeah, and I'm just wondering if we need to talk more about those buckets, the like air impacts, water impacts, climate, health, housing, green space. Like list out those buckets that we suggest considering. So maybe that fits into the body of the section as well. Yes, I think a lot of this is good though. Yeah, and I think maybe that weighting in the tier 1 part about the weighting thing has more to do with the threshold maps, and people can, choose to do one that's based on hopefully sound science related to the topics we're looking at. But yeah, maybe there could be more guidance in the technical documentation on that. Yeah, thanks.
Ari? I don't think I can hear Ari.
Hi, sorry. Sorry, can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I was gonna say, I think that tier 1 major, to me, that it was definitely, I think there has some question whether we should include it at all, but it certainly wouldn't, in my mind, be a major conclusion. Perhaps maybe sort of SAB considers, the ability for individual users is probably, to me, like a tier 3. And I do think that tier 2 should probably be tier 1. And I do think, given what was discussed in some of the earlier charged questions, I think we're in agreement that we don't have a weighting scheme at this time, but maybe in taking into account what Esther said, I think I like the first part of the sentence, or just say at this time we don't support a weighting scheme, but encourage more research or something like that.
Jim?
I want to make a comment sort of from the 20,000-foot level on weighting and also cumulative impact scoring. We sort of have a tension here between what users want and what we as a scientific advisory panel can justify and recommend. It seems to me that if people want to apply weights for a specific policy initiative or a local issue, I don't see anything wrong with them applying weights as long as EJScreen and EPA makes it clear that there's no scientific justification for weighting these indicators at all. There may be a policy reason for weighting. And it was my understanding from our discussions earlier that people really want to apply weights, and so perhaps allowing them to, but not justifying that those weights are meaningful statewide or nationwide or really meaningful at all. So the difficult aspect of this to me is balancing what users want and what we can reasonably justify from a scientific point of view is prudent.
Esther, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think the other thing we need to balance is that sometimes there's quite a bit of lag between science and what's actually being experienced on the ground, right? You have to do the research and time goes on. And by EPA, if we recommend them to not take or consider the cumulative approach, that is also making a scientific decision that doesn't acknowledge that these combined exposures and vulnerability all actually happen. And different community leaders have actually voiced that. And if you're not doing anything, that's also making a scientific decision that there isn't an interaction. And I want to be careful that any recommendations we do don't accidentally imply that there isn't one.
Jim?
I agree with you, and I don't think anyone is not acknowledged. I don't think anyone is saying that cumulative effects don't exist. The question from the standpoint of EJScreen and this scientific advisory board is whether or not the indicators in EJScreen reflect differential risk and could be used in a quantitative or semi-quantitative way to develop some sort of cumulative impact score. And I don't think the indicators do, which is why I don't support there being a cumulative impact score. But I certainly don't want to give the impression or squelch consideration of cumulative effects.
We have Sakobi next and then Veronica.
Yeah, I think we need to not conflate cumulative impacts, cumulative effects, and cumulative risks with each other. As part of the discussion with the cumulative impacts working group, we're talking about looking at differential burden and disparate exposures, right? As part of the framing behind looking at cumulative impacts. But I was in a discussion recently. This is not about biological susceptibility. It's not about risk. But I will use a risk example to kind of clarify the point of why weights are important. In risk assessment, we use weights all the time. Hey, we don't know a lot about this health effect. Hey, children may be impacted. We're gonna get a protective factor of 100. Hey, we haven't done the animal studies yet, but we have good animal studies. We'll give another protective factor. That's a weight, right? And there's some assumptions behind those weights. Similar approach, again, that's cumulative risk. We're talking about cumulative impacts. They're not the same thing. You can use a similar approach with using a weight system, which can be mathematically driven using weights, as we said before, and or based on inform, which EJ is all about, communities, contextual expertise, knowledge, and experiences as it relates to the weights. Weighting the indicators that are important to them, because these are place-based phenomena when it comes to differential burden exposure and impacts that we're talking about. So I'm going to push back on the issue of not having weights. And because weights are used scientifically, we use weights in cumulative risk assessment, but this is not cumulative risk assessment. This is cumulative impact assessment, but the methodological kind of framework is adaptable to looking at cumulative impacts.
Veronica?
Yeah, so I wanted to actually support James' position. I think that weights, yes, are mathematically, but how you find the optimal weight is the problem. And there is a difference between what we do in research and what EPA does. Whenever EPA does something, it takes a different weight and a different relevance to the public, which is the reason why some of the data sets or other things that EPA generates are sometimes not available to the public until they have been vetted and tested and the validity has been ensured. This is true for the CMAQ output that is used for air pollution that is not typically, was not available for a long time until EPA had the possibility to vet it. And so I think the same thing here, we need to consider what is that EPA is putting out with its name and stamp behind and how that is interpreted by the user. It has a different weight than when a researcher publishes paper and suggests method because there is not the stamp of the government behind. So I think this is really a key consideration. We can all come up with different weighting scheme, but the weighting scheme that Sakobi used might be different by the weighting scheme that I use, but it doesn't have the name or EPA branding behind. So I think this is an important consideration to take, especially thinking about the users who are using this. But this is first point. Second point is the question of risk versus impact. So if we're talking about cumulative impact, this means that there is an epidemiological analysis that is done to support why a certain weighted scheme is used. The same way as EPA has waited years and years to use the word causal association between air pollution and health, and it had to be having a lot of evidence to make those statements, the same consideration has to be made here. If we are saying that something has an impact on health and we are suggesting this weighting scheme, that weighting scheme has to be supported by a lot of evidence. Being a little bit approximative, and being like lighthearted when we put out weights that are not supported by evidence, that's how distrust in government and science actually arises, because people are saying, you told me something and now it's not true. So I think it's really important that we understand the seriousness of what EPA puts out and how that should be really supported by evidence to avoid then having to backtrack and having to change the weighting mechanism that we're putting out. So I think that keeping the weights to the user and being clear that these weights that the user use has no, at the moment, no scientific evidence, it's really key. And so I wanted to convey that and support James in his statement.
Sakobi?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with the last set of comments. As I've said before, there's a whole cumulative impacts work group that's talking about cumulative impacts, frameworks, and using scientific evidence to inform cumulative impacts framework development and decision-making. So statement made that we're not talking about using evidence, I think is problematic. The whole idea around cumulative impacts from what we talk about in the EJ space is looking at differential burden and differential exposures. And there's evidence behind that, the research on how race is the single biggest predictor of the distribution of hazards. There's a lot of evidence about differential exposure as it relates to stressors. There's plenty of evidence out there. Now, I'm not going to get into the causal linkage because that's not what we're doing with risk. We're not bringing, when cumulative impacts, we're not talking about risk. I'm going to say it again. It's not about risk. But the evidence as it relates to the weighting needed to look at differential burden and disparate impact, the evidence has been there for 30, 40 years. So we are building even better evidence with hyperlocal air quality monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. So there's two different things. You can have the EPA-based scientific evidence weights, and then also you have the evidence, the scientific, quantitative, semi-qualitative, hyperlocal evidence of community folks to customize their own weights. I don't understand what the issue is with valuing that type of evidence, because there's different types of evidence and data. So I think we need to be very careful, because again, this ain't about us. It's about the communities and leveraging the data and evidence that's already out there to inform cumulative impacts analysis, where there is 30, 40 years of body of evidence, and even more evidence has been collected. And as a personal bias note, I just got my just-in-time back on my proposal. So I thank y'all for not polluting the pool. But in that proposal that I joked about last time, we're going to be talking about developing weights to look at cumulative impacts for Maryland EJScreen. So people like me and others are building a scientific basis for looking at weights two ways, mathematically and also bringing in community context. So we're already doing it, y'all. The EPA needs to catch up.
I think we have Veronica. Carolyn, right? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand, but I think there is a difference between specifying this is a weight of 1/3 versus saying this is a factor that is important. So I am just debating on the assigning of numerical values to things when there is not yet in my opinion, there is not yet agreement of what should be the weight that each factor should receive. So it's just the numerical value that we're assigning to these weights, which I think we're not ready to release that in a consensual way for everything, for across the United States.
So listening to this discussion and Dr. Saad's question about charge question 12 and how to move forward, I have a suggestion. We're getting to consensus at this point. It's great discussion, a lot of good information, but one option we could do moving forward is do a small work group. The individuals for charge or category 4 meet offline. It'll be less than half the panel, so that's okay.
Hi, everyone.
Go ahead, Zaida. I think my Zoom cut off for a second.
No, go ahead, Caroline. Keep going. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just going to offer that we could do a closed session with the group from topic category 4 to discuss both charge question 12 and 13 and get language that the group can agree upon, that then can be incorporated into the draft and presented at the August meeting to the entire panel to then come to consensus on. And that way there can be further discussion about the recommendations to be included and how to best offer guidance to the EPA. So Dr. Chakraborty, if that sounds okay with you and the rest of the team and the rest of the panel, then
and those involved with topic category 4, I think that's important. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I would note, I think Dr. Konoski brought up that topic category 1 touches on weighting, and I'm not sure if he wants to be included in this group. If he's included, it's still just under half the panel, but it might be relevant to have him included since it's, somewhat overlap with his topic, if he's available. I don't know. I also know he had to hop off for a little bit of the meeting, so I can reach out to him after the meeting and see if that's okay. And if everybody agrees, then you and I, Dr. Chakraborty, can work with setting that meeting up where you will also be present, and either myself or Dr. Figueroa will be there as the DFO.
And James, is that fine with you as well?
I think that's a great solution, particularly if we have discussions about charge question 13 and 12.
Okay. Sorry, I got a note. Yes, Dr. Min, she has been providing a lot of good content as well, but I don't think she's in topic category 4. So I think what we can do is see from the individuals from topic category 4 if anyone is not interested in participating in this small group, that maybe Dr. Min could take their place so that we don't go over into a majority. Maybe if I'll just, Dr. Shakabori, if you just want to go through each member and ask if they want to participate from topic category 4.
So we have Ari, Quinn, Veronica, Sakobi, and Anne, right?
And Dr. Collins and Dr. Ock.
And I will remove myself from this discussion. So,
Okay.
because I had just provided comments and in the original thing, I was not part of the original team. So I will remove myself to make room for the other person.
Great.
I'm in the same boat. This is Tim Collins. I don't need to be a part of this specific discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, me neither.
Okay.
Veronica?
I am fine. If James wants me to be there, I can be there. Otherwise, I think me and James are along the same lines. So
I would leave it up to you, Veronica, whatever you want to do, but
okay.
I agree.
Okay.
And Sakobi?
I'm happy to stay on. I mean, Esther and I are based on the same accord. So if it, so I know I'm on multiple topics, but yeah, I'm happy to continue to contribute.
Okay. So just to clarify, the individuals who want to be part of the small group to discuss charge question 12 and 13 would be Dr. Sad, Dr. Barakal, optional, Dr. Sakobi, and Dr. Min. And then Dr. Shakaborty, myself, and then Dr. Figueroa will also be present. Is that correct, or did I miss anyone? I just want to make sure I include the correct people on the email chain.
And yeah, because it was Quinn and
Sorry, can you hear
Ari,
me?
right?
This is Ari. Sorry, Ari. Yeah.
Yes.
And Queen Clara, I believe.
Would like to also be, okay, so Carr and Lewis. So 1, 2, 5, 6. Excellent. Okay, that keeps us under half the panel, so we can move forward with that small group discussion. And I'll send out more information on when we can set up that meeting and seek availability from that group.
All right.
I do, maybe Dr. Shakaborty, if you want to seek consensus from the entire panel to see if that's okay.
Yeah, I was going to,
Okay,
think
great.
of the best possible way to frame this as a motion, but
Right.
yeah, do we have consensus for a small group meeting to finalize the language and how best to articulate charge questions 12 and 13? And I need a yes or no.
Yes.
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 All right. Thank you. So that concludes our discussion for the charge questions related to topic category number 4.
Jay, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because of the small group meeting, I will suspend my rewriting of charge question 12.
Yes, of course.
Until
it will be finalized at that meeting. Yes,
right,
the
okay.
language.
Thank you.
Yeah. So before we move on to the final topic category number 5, I think the agenda says that we need to take a 10-minute break, right? And I suggest, just looking at the clock right here, that we resume our discussions, well, the topic category number 5 at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Caroline, can you confirm that is correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Because I'm in different time zones, I want to make sure, yeah.
Right.
It's 2:05 p.m. Eastern is when we're going to meet again here. Thank you. All right. Welcome back, everyone, from the break. We are now ready to continue our panel discussion and moving on now to recommendations for topic number 5, which focuses on better consideration of rural geographies within EJScreen, and which actually comprises questions 14, 15, and 16. But I would like to remind the panel that about some changes that happened during our meeting in May. Original charge question 14 is now 16. The original charge question 15 is now question 14. And the original question 16 is now question 15. Yeah, I think I got that correct. But I'd like to invite Tim Collins to read charge question 14 first and the recommendations for the charge.
Thanks, Jay. So charge question 14 states, currently there's not a definition of rural communities in EJScreen. To implement different calculations for rural and urban communities, EJScreen will need to start by defining this term. What is an appropriate and scientifically defensible definition of rural communities for use in an EJScreen context? So it's a fairly long tier 1. The bullet point under tier 1 or recommendation states, there's not a nationally consistent hard break between urban and rural areas with respect to environmental justice issues. The SAB suggests that EPA adopts the operational definitions embedded in existing nationally consistent rural-urban continuum classification data sets that are selected for integration within EJScreen. Some of these classification systems implicitly incorporate the limited or lack of critical infrastructure and access to services that in many ways are defining characteristics of rural communities. Some examples of nationally consistent continuum definitions that would be appropriate are rural-urban commuting areas, rural-urban continuum codes, or frontier and remote areas codes. And I'll just read all of them then, right, Jay? Tier 2, we don't have anything there currently. Tier 3, the SAB recommends that the agency revisit whether an explicit definition of rural communities or urban communities or other communities situated along the rural-urban continuum is needed based on user feedback and research regarding the strengths and limitations of the new rural-urban stratification functionality in EJScreen. The EPA should consider the use of national land cover data sets for classifying areas along the rural-urban continuum.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. I will now request feedback from panel members who contributed to this topic category number 5 first. Opening it up for discussion now with the rest of the panel. Any comments, feedback, suggestions? Okay, looks like we have complete consensus for the responses to charge question number 14. In favor of the responses that you see on this slide, can I get a yes?
Yes.
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 Anyone who opposes the content of this slide in terms of responses to question 4? Okay, so it's approved. We can now move on to charge question 15.
Charge question 15 states, what currently available nationally consistent environmental data sets could be used to identify vulnerable rural communities overburdened by pollution? Tier 1 recommendation, we have systematically examine alternative rural-urban continuum classifications in existing nationally consistent data set to determine which classification or classifications is best suited for integration within EJScreen. Use direct field observation or ground truthing and rural community input to identify the best suited classification system. Tier 2, systematically examine environmental, social, health, and infrastructural data sets identified by the panel and select indicators that are applicable to rural environmental justice issues for inclusion in EJScreen. And we actually prepared an attached data set table that's in the draft document. While the panel recognizes that EPA wishes to utilize only nationally consistent data sets, we recommend more flexible utilization of high quality data sets in EJScreen because some environmental justice concerns in rural communities are regionally distributed. And in such cases, the concept of nationally consistent is not applicable. Tier 3, the EPA should consider integrating indicators of pro-environmental actions, for example, safe drinking water compliance or lack of significant non-compliance violations, infrastructure investments, environmental justice project implementation, etc., and indicators of significant positive or negative changes in environmental justice indexes over time. EPA should determine how to optimally integrate calculation approaches in the EJScreen platform for the newly selected environmental, social, health, and infrastructural indicators to ensure fuller representation of places along the rural-urban continuum. This includes determinations regarding how to perform indicator calculations and how to include newly selected indicators within the EJScreen platform. For example, as within the Environmental Justice Index, Supplemental Index, or as standalone indicators, or within sort of some of these new domains that people have alluded to within some of the other charge questions.
Thanks, Tim. So any feedback, comments, or questions from panel members who contributed to this question? Anne, go ahead.
Thank you. And thanks, Tim, for summarizing things. It strikes me that I know in the context of, this was in the context of the rural communities, but that first bullet point under the long term, I think we were talking holistically. So I'm not sure if there's space in this final report to indicate that, but having pro-environmental, especially as we move, as EPA moves to having, you know, potentially a version 3 of EJScreen, and because it's existed for such a, the EJScreen has existed for such a long time, we are able to make some comparisons over time now. So I'm not sure if there's space to, I mean, certainly I agree that it should be within this question, but this also can apply to all areas as well.
Thanks. Any other comments or feedback from any panel member present here today? Adriana.
Yes, thank you. Just going back to Anne's point about the changes in environmental justice indexes over time, it would be very useful to put it more visually because we also want to see progress so that we don't actually signal environmental justice injustice and as another form of current redlining and you know, completely undermining the overall goal of this effort. So showing this change over time can see progress towards achieving justice and including it as part of the EJScreen. I think that was part of the discussion as I remember it. Thanks.
Any other comments or feedback? So without getting into the exact language, we do have a recommendation for modifying the current recommendation for tier 1, right? And again, I just wanted to double check with Tim. You can work with the individuals who suggested the recommendation in terms of the exact wording, but that's kind of basically what we're looking at here, right?
Okay, let me see. I understand. So you're talking about the tier 1 major recommendation, Jay, for this charge question?
Yeah, I'm going back to Anne's comment, right? Yeah.
Oh, actually, I meant the tier 3.
Tier 3
long
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the first bullet. Yeah.
Yeah, and
that was what that's what I understood.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
And really, it's more of a clarification. Is there a concept or a way to include that in an overarching? I mean, it could certainly remain here, but be an overarching recommendation.
Yeah, my observation, and I think that's a good point to bring up, because I do think considering the inclusion of like pro-environmental actions speaks to data sets, so it speaks to this charge question. I feel like the changes in environmental justice indexes over time element is something perhaps bigger, or not just, it's not really subsumed within this question, within a response to this charge question.
And Adriana, do you have a follow-up comment? I see your hand raised.
Sorry, I didn't lower it, but no, I just agree with what Tim said, that it's probably not specific to this charge question, but maybe some overarching goal that, like Anne said.
The ability to observe how things have changed over time. Okay. Yeah, I don't think there's a charge question that directly relates to that, but something that can be. Yes, go ahead, David. Yeah.
Yeah, this is David Kaminsky. I guess I agree that this tier 3, the first bullet point, is actually 2 points, and I would, I guess, lobby to keep the first part of it here. But the changes over time, I think, is difficult. I remember Ty and Matt telling us during our meetings last May that methodologically, there's no simple way to do this, right? Because the way to index, the way EJScreen has changed over time, there's not comparable data over the lifespan of the tool. So it's not obvious how this can be done. These are the confines of the current tool. So I wonder if we should just strike that component altogether, although I certainly appreciate the value in trying to understand how circumstances on the ground have changed over time. I'm just not sure that it's functional given EJScreen.
Thanks. Cindy?
Yeah, thanks. I was gonna just second what David was saying. In addition to the difficulty of having comparable data set over the lifespan of EJScreen, another issue that Adriana just brought up reminds me of the fact that since it's a percentile, there will always be 100th percentile in the country, and we don't necessarily want to highlight communities, sort of like the modern redlining concept. Even though over time, maybe the actual concentration has improved, the contamination concentration has improved over time, there will still always be a 100th percentile. So I completely agree with what David just suggested by removing the second part from the first bullet in the tier 3 recommendation.
Okay. So I think we have a pretty clear recommendation that relates to that bullet under tier 3. And unless there are any other comments or feedback, are we all in favor of making that change for tier 3 under charge question 15? Can I just get a yes or no for those in favor?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Anyone? Okay. Anyone who disagrees with that consensus? No. Okay. So we can now move to charge question 16.
Charge question 16 states, currently there is no differentiation between urban and rural communities within EJScreen. The tools use the same calculations and indicators for the entire country. Please comment on A, whether EJScreen should incorporate different calculations or levels of comparison for rural versus urban locations to ensure fuller representation of both locations in the tool, and B, how the tool could better represent rural and urban locations. So our tier 1 recommendation states, assessing environmental justice nationwide requires a comprehensive approach that considers both environmental and social factors, as well as how those factors vary across the rural-urban continuum. It is critical to work with communities to ensure that the EJScreen assessment approach, including indicator selection and calculation, is informed in part by their local knowledge and priorities. The SAB recommends that the EPA research with input from rural organizations and communities how to optimally integrate rural-urban continuum classification into the EJScreen platform to enable stratification of block groups and comparisons at national and state levels, and then implement rural-urban stratification functionality within EJScreen. Tier 2, we don't have a recommendation. Tier 3, the SAB recommends for the EPA to revisit whether an explicit definition of rural communities is needed based on user feedback and research regarding the strengths and limitations of the new rural-urban stratification functionality in EJScreen. Consider the use of national land cover data sets for classifying areas along the rural-urban continuum.
All right. Feedback from panel members who contributed to this charge question or topic category.
Hello, this is Anne. I would just include on the first tier 1 major, the bullet, SAB recommends that the EPA research with input from rural states, rural organizations, and communities. So just input rural states into those organizations that EPA will collaboratively research.
Any other comments or feedback from any of our panel members? Okay, so we have one recommendation for wording change, add the word states, right? Rural states under the response to tier 1. And and I'll check for consensus. So all those in favor of making that minor change to the wording in that sentence for tier 1?
Yes.
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 Thank you. And anyone opposed or disagrees with this, with the consensus opinion? No, so we'll move forward with this change, and that concludes our discussion of questions for topic category number 5. So thank you, Tim Collins and other panel members who contributed to these responses. And we are done with our panel discussion of the 16 charge questions, right? Which was our kind of the main responsibility for today. And moving on now to the next slide, I guess, is, well, the next steps. The first or the most important next step, of course, is the draft report writing. And the goal of the lead writers and the assigned panel members now is to kind of capture the changes and recommendations made during today's meeting for the topic category, revise the wording and layout to include topic headers and a clear distinction between, what would appear as a recommendation and what is more of a suggestion, an area for the EPA and other, agencies to explore. I mean, this applies to all charge questions except probably the 2 that we're going to have another discussion, 12 and 13, as we had agreed upon earlier. And in terms of the email correspondence, as you said before, members should copy the DFOs, both Carolyn and Zaida, as well as myself, in their email correspondence. And also kind of wanted to point out the integrated responses for topic category 2 that was compiled by Veronica and her colleagues. That's a good example of including topic headers and making a clear distinction between recommendation and tier. So that's something that would be kind of the format we eventually have to follow. And in terms of our timeline, as shown in this slide, that note that in preparation for our August meeting, where the panel will review and provide consensus in what we'll call the draft report, the lead writers must submit their section of the draft report to the DFOs and myself by Monday, June 10th. And that report will be posted for public comment in approximately 2 weeks. And that will give enough time for the document to be available publicly before our virtual public meeting that will take place in mid-August. So that's kind of the timeline that you have seen before in one of the memos that was sent by Carolyn to all of you earlier. And moving on to the next slide, there are a few other things to keep in mind in terms of the draft report writing that are summarized here. You will see that lead writers should work with their assigned panel members to edit the responses to the charge questions that fall under the topic category, and everyone should be using the integrated draft response to charge questions as a starting point for providing edits for the topic category. And individuals who provided additional recommendations, today mostly we had consensus for almost everything, should provide the exact language to the lead writer to be included in their edits. And in case there are any non-consensus comments, might happen for a couple of questions. Plus, make sure that you indicate the recommendation will be included in the appendix or as an appendix, since it's a minority opinion. And lead writers may reach out to individual panel members who identified a recommendation or content within the integrated draft that needs to be modified or revised. And the draft report needs to have one voice with consensus, so no individual comments should be included any longer in this document that needs to be submitted on or by July 10th. Next slide, please. Okay. So you need to also identify topic headers for paragraph sections within the responses to the charge questions. Identify the correct tier for any recommendation you make. Provide adequate justification for all recommendations in the body of the report. Identify recommendations or suggestions that require additional research or interagency or intra-agency coordination. And of course, our DFO Carolyn will be sending more information about the August virtual public meeting and related requirements and documents. And as always, all meeting materials are required to be posted on the SAB website like you've seen before. And I think that concludes everything I had from my end. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn, unless there are any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. I would like to note with the timeline, since we will have a small group working on charge question 12 and 13, we'll come up with a revised timeline for that section, because I'm not sure if July 10th is reasonable, considering we have to set up a meeting and get everybody together to allow enough time for Dr. Sad to then work off of the integrated draft. So with that being said, I would like to thank everyone who participated into, go ahead, Anne.
I'm sorry, I seem to have questions. If I have just some like edit things and other stuff that I notice, should I send that to the lead writers for those topic categories?
Yes, to the lead
Okay.
writer, and then, as we say often, CC the chair and the DFOs.
Okay,
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's excellent. Thank you, Anne. Any other questions regarding next steps, report writing, the virtual public meeting in August, which I'll send more information out about following this meeting? I don't see any hands. So I just want to really thank all of you for your hard work and dedication. There's been a lot of effort put in this far, and we have a little more to go. I'm excited to see what the draft report looks like come August. So Dr. Figueroa and I will be working together with Dr. Chakraborty to pull together all the information that we receive from the lead writers to develop that draft report that will then be, as Dr. Chakraborty said, will be shared with all of you to review prior to the August meeting, but also the public so that they have an opportunity to provide any feedback that they wish. And with that being said, I would like to also thank the EPA staff from the Office of Environmental Justice group. Ty, thank you for presenting to our group today, and Dr. Chakraborty for your efforts in leading us through this great meeting. And with that, I'm going to close the meeting and wish you all a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Y'all take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to check. You already sent me, okay, for tomorrow's meeting, right?
Yep. Yeah. And it'll just be you and I, because I think Zaida is not available then, but we'll just check in about next steps
Okay.
and talk about how to have the
Okay.
small group to discuss 12 and 13.
Yeah,
Great
and
job today, by the way.
my travel schedule, right? So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. I
So
believe you said I had it until the 5th. You're not available. Is that correct?
yeah, because of well, actually the 2nd, but the 4th of July holiday at your
Right.
end, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I'm hoping that maybe we can get the small group together later in the week or the following week and not delay it too long. Go ahead, Zaida.
Hi, Dr. Chakraborty and CK, amazing meeting. Honestly, very, very good. So kudos on that. And thank you to to Will and Kurt for helping
Thank
us
you.
and facilitating. I just have
I-
a question about your availability next week. So when is that you're going to be, I guess, unavailable?
I forgot to CC you on that. I sent it to Carol in my schedule. Yeah.
Do you still need to approve the meeting minutes? That's why I'm asking. And tomorrow, unfortunately, I will not be able to join the meeting.
You're not joining the other meeting?
I will not be able to join tomorrow's meeting, the checking.
Oh, okay. Well, for
Yeah.
me, it's today. It's today because it's past midnight.
Okay. Oh my goodness. So basically, when are you available to approve the meeting minutes next week, or you're not available at all?
Zaida and Jay, quick interjection. Are we able to stop live streaming at this point? Will or Curd? And if not, we could hop off on another side meeting.
Just give me 1 second. It should stop.
Okay.